In the event or the unlikely event of an emergency, we'll gather outside the building in front of the front doors on the other side of the road. As you know, I extend an invitation to any political colleagues from around the Bay of Plenty and regional council members to participate in these meetings, and I give them speaking rights. That's a captain's call. And in the unlikely event of us having to take a vote, I'll explain who's actually voting, but essentially it's the chairs, the mayors and Waka Kotahi. So I have to make an obligatory statement, which I will now read. And I remind committee members that this meeting is being live streamed and recorded, and it will be made available on the Bay of Plenty Regional Council website following the meeting and archived for a period of 3 years. Our purpose is to provide greater access to council debate, our decision making, and encouraging openness and transparency. I also remind all present that local government decision making affords no protection to councillors, council officers and the public for comments made during meetings that are subsequently challenged in a court of law and determined to be slanderous. I just ask, as we have quite a few people on Zoom today, can everyone ensure that they use their microphones when speaking? And that also assists the staff with regards monitoring the live stream. So, Mike, you might like to introduce your staff that are here today and will be participating in the meeting. Mike Seaborn, Public Transport Director, everybody.
Hello everyone, my name is Mike Seaborn. I'm fairly fresh into the Bay of Plenty again. I'm the Public Transport Director for the Regional Council. Just like to introduce the team sitting down the back there with Oliver Haycock, who's the Manager of Transport Planning. We've got Andrew Williams and Brian Healy down the back there to support the papers of today. And thanks for that.
Good. In terms of the order of business, I'm holding an apology from Commissioner Anne Tolley, Dan Kneebone of the Port of Tauranga, Chairman Leader from the Bay of Plenty Regional Council, and Her Worship Mayor Tapsell has indicated that she is an early departure today, and likewise Stacey from the Automobile Association. You're also flagged. Okay, that's fine. So are there any further apologies? Anybody? There being none, I'll move. Seconded, Her Worship Mayor Tapsell. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. There's no public forum in this meeting. There are no late items that have been tabled. And I will just go into the order of business and note that in terms of the appointment of Greg Pert, our new freight advisor, we will take that after item 6. Are there any declarations of conflicts of interest, anybody? Good. There being none. The minutes have been circulated. They're on page 8. I've been instructed, because they were signed and sealed by the last triennium, we just received those today. And so we just move on. Were there any matters arising from those minutes? Anyone got a good memory going back to the 19th of September last year? Oh, we will move on. And we've now come to the appointment of the freight advisor and item number 6. We'd like a move and seconded for that. I'll move, seconded by Jessica. You can do the second. Seconded to they be received. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. Can I just ask you, we're going to be jumping now right to the back of the agenda. If I can take you over to page 222. So, in your hands, Michael. This is the appointment of a freight advisor and confirmation of external advisors. So this will enable Greg to fully participate in this meeting today.
Just take the report as read. We've got some explanation around that. I don't think there's anything really further to say, Chair.
And there are recommendations on the bottom of page 222. that flow over to page 223, essentially appointing all those individuals, Greg Pert, Dan Kneebone, Glenn Crowther, and Inspector Stuart Nightingale, who's in the room with us here today, and Stacey Spall from the New Zealand Automobile Association. And I would also like to add a further point, item number 7, to that recommendation, that we write an appropriate letter to John Galbraith, thank you for his contribution to transport in the Bay of Plenty over many, many years. Mayor Denny, are you happy to second that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'll put that. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. So, with your indulgence, we will now toss the agenda back to the very beginning of it, and we will now go to page 20. 20, land transport planning. Darren Davis. Darren, you with us? Come forward. This is Darren, everyone, from MR Cagney, Technical Director for Public Transport and Planning, and it includes a PowerPoint presentation. So, good to have you with us.
Kia ora tātou, ko Darren Davis tōku whenua, no tamaki makaurau aho. I'm Darren Davis, Technical Director at MR Cagney. I am the rarest of species, a Jaffa that was born in Auckland, lived there my whole life. I've been involved in transport for around 30 years or so, and in that time I've been involved in certainly Auckland's transport journey, from being a very car dominated city to being one that does provide sort of better transport choice now, or will provide better transport choice when public transport's more reliable than it currently is, but that's a work in progress. I've got a presentation for you which is going to focus on a little bit of transport context. It's going to talk about what is in the indicative government policy statement for land transport for 2024, and noting that those indications are moving around the place at the moment and haven't necessarily completely landed. And I'm just going to talk through a number of what I think are key transport planning concepts to keep in mind. It's going to take me about 20 minutes if I go at a decent trot through this presentation, so just ask for your sort of indulgence with that. So
Darren, are you happy to take questions throughout this? Or would you prefer to have it at the end, give you a free run?
Probably best to have it at the end, but
Okay.
I'm sure you'll have questions, so maybe just note them down, okay, and hit me up with them when I get to the slide that says questions on it. So,
excellent. No, thank you. Go for it.
Okay, so we can move slide. Oh, have I got a controller? Wow. Okay, do I have to point it somewhere? Well, that worked. So I'll start with a little bit of context. You'll obviously know this. The meat of it is really around the indicative strategic priorities, and the sort of wrap up with a number of what I think are key concepts to keep in mind around transport planning. So first thing is, definition of transport. I mean, it's probably fairly obvious, it's moving things from one place to another by, some vehicle or other, but remembering that it's not an end, but a means to an end. It only exists because land use creates the need for mobility. And I love this quote from Brent Todderan, the former chief planner of Vancouver. The best transportation plan is a great land use plan. If you get your land use planning right, that makes your transport a lot easier, and a lot easier to be more sustainable about that. So you'll know, all of this stuff. Population of the Bay of Plenty. There's a lot of growth in the Western Bay sub-region, and Tauranga, Eastern Bay is growing slower, but there are pockets of high deprivation. There are real access issues in the Eastern Bay, in my view. Rotorua is focusing on recovering the tourism industry and obviously has a housing shortage. One important point is that the new normal post-pandemic really is still emerging. We don't kind of know exactly what shape that will take, and it's likely to be different than what existed prior to the pandemic. So I'll talk through some indicative strategic priorities, and this one here, the overarching focus on emissions reduction. You may have heard some media coverage around that, where there's going to be so much emphasis on that as an overarching focus. But that said, all of the other elements are really important elements to it and sort of should contribute to that in some way, shape or form. And you can see what those elements are: integrated freight, safety, sort of resilience, which is very top of mind for us at the moment, sustainable urban development, which is key to getting to where we need to get to, and the rather important issue of maintaining and operating the transport network. So probably hard to read there, but that's the Ministry of Transport Transport Outcomes Framework. That's really what should be guiding investment in the transport sector, and it sees all of the elements of the transport network as interconnected as they are, because one influences the other. So if we're talking about the overarching focus on emissions reduction, transport's about 44% of the Bay of Plenty's emissions. The emissions reduction plan, and this is separate from anything that comes out of the government policy statement. So it's about reducing the total vehicle kilometres travelled by 20% by 2035, and that's over what it would have been, not an absolute. So it's increasing zero emission vehicles, by to 30%, reducing emissions by freight, and intensity of transport fuel. So there's some quite big asks in that, and we're facing some quite big challenges. And obviously recent severe event weathers have really kind of slapped us in the face with sort of what climate change means and what the implications of that are for Aotearoa New Zealand. So when you look at that in a Bay of Plenty context, that's a potential reduction of 750 million kilometres of travel annually by 2035. I mean, that's a really big figure. And for my sins, I'm on the challenge team for the National VKT Reduction Plan, and I have to say that that's something that central government is grappling with and at the moment, and with the expectation that Tier 1 regions, including Western Bay, will do an emissions reduction plan in the second half of this year, and Tier 2, including Rotorua, will do it in the first half of 2024. So talking about an integrated freight system, rail freight has a really significant role in the Bay of Plenty. Apparently, I didn't know this, the East Coast Main Truck carries a third of New Zealand's rail traffic. Most densely utilised section of the national rail network, the Port of Tauranga, handles 30% of New Zealand's ports and imports, but 40% of port freight moves by rail. Aim to increase that. One of the things to be aware of is that conflicts at level crossings will increase at peak time with additional trains, and that does need to be taken into account. If you increase trains going across a level crossing, that can trigger a requirement for a level crossing safety impact assessment and consideration of what measures might be needed to mitigate that to ensure safety for all transport system participants. And probably the point that what happens in the Waikato as a major transit region and in the Auckland network is actually really important to the Bay of Plenty. That whole upper North Island supply chain has to run as an integrated supply chain, particularly given the role of Port of Tauranga as a major important export port for the country. And that means we need to keep in mind sort of resilience issues with the rail network. So, and while rail freight is important, it's part of the freight ecosystem, and with road-based freight, they need to work together. They have different strengths, and one can't do the job alone. And the recent storms have highlighted vulnerability of the key links in the network, both East Coast Main Truck Line and a variety of really important transport links. And that's really top of mind in the Hawke's Bay, particularly at the moment, where absence of links between Napier and Hastings means there's no public transport between the two cities, and road-based journeys are delayed by up to hours on end on the remaining sort of river links. It just really makes that front of centre. And so there will be a focus on the resilience of existing networks, and that's going to be important, and it's likely to come ahead of roadway capacity expansion in the short term. Obvious point that congestion, especially in Tauranga, really negatively impacts freight, and time is money in the freight industry, but mode shift from car to other modes is a significant tool to improve freight productivity. So talking about safety, primary focus is to move towards Vision Zero, the concept that it's not acceptable for there to be deaths and injuries in the transport network. Some quite ambitious goals about reducing deaths and serious injuries by 40% by 2030. They've been on the rise over the last 5 years, and there's a mixture of urban and rural interventions and need to think about the safety of people both inside and outside of vehicles. And this graph shows sort of what it looks like, the overall trend after quite a number of years of improvement, and you can see the trend line at the top of the graph, and it's been not doing very well over the last few years. The trend line's been heading in the wrong direction, with the notable impact of the pandemic, where by the very nature that we weren't travelling during lockdown led to a reduction in road trauma during that period. So resilience is a strategic priority and very much front of mind at the moment. I'm just looking out the window of the Matapihi rail bridge and just wondering, if you took out that connection in your transport network or any of the other major connections, what the impact on the Bay of Plenty would be. Karanghaki Gorge to Kaimais, obviously Waiawika Gorge to Gisborne's been impacted, 35 around East Cape. So, this is going to be a real focus. But I'd make the point that resilience is also about transport choice, network choice, route choice, mode choice. So while strengthening the most vulnerable links in the state highway network is a really important element of it, there are other elements that come into the resilience conversation. So maintaining and operating the system. There's been lots of conversations about sort of potholes on the roading network, and there's quite a lot of maintenance happening on the network at the moment to try and sort of address some of the maintenance issues on the network. The extreme weather events are just going to make the maintenance costs higher, but there's a focus in the indications in the GPS of building back better rather than replacing like with like. What that looks like and what that really means and how much that costs is a bit of an open question. So urban development. So inclusive access is really the concept of providing people transport choices so that there are good choices to walk, cycle or use public transport, particularly in urban context, but there are also significant rural and sort of non-urban issues. Just pointed out some of the targets in the current RLTP. It should be the slight misspell there, apologies for that. My proofreading wasn't perfect. And the RPTP, Regional Public Transport Plan. And there's various bits of central government guidance on that front through the National Policy Statement, RMA Amendment, the Medium Density Residential Standards. And really important point that if you get your land use right, if you concentrate density on corridors that are able to be served by frequent public transport, that's really one of the best ways you can do to achieve mode shift. So again, getting your land use right is important and critical to getting your transport right. Noting in there that the GPS focuses on urban issues, but rural issues are almost explicitly not in there, and I think that doesn't make those issues go away. This is just it's an interesting graphic because it shows you how I put this in because it shows you how data is misleading, because it shows you that Kawerau has really great access to public transport, but that service only runs a couple of days a week. And so it may look really great on paper, but it's not, it's not a very good measure. So I just sort of put that in there as a bit of an illustration of that. Talk about funding sources. About 55% of transport funding comes from the National Land Transport Fund. The current program, the 21 programs, propped up by a $2 billion Crown loan to be repaid with interest over the next 2 NLTP periods. That's to be confirmed whether that in fact happens. The other 45% comes from all sorts of different sources: local share, public transport fares, NZ upgrade, direct government investment in the rail network investment program, transport choices, etc., and development contributions. Obvious point that state highways get 100% funding, others get a co-share and require the local share to unlock that national share, and all the signals are that funding is going to be pretty constrained in the next NLT period, and there's going to be a focus on responding to the recent extreme weather events. So, summary, there's an emissions reduction focus on mode shift and choice, improving resilience, reducing deaths and serious injuries, rail, freight, coastal shipping and resilience, building back better, noting funding constraints, and my point down the bottom, election year, the only thing that is certain is there will be uncertainties, and some of these are kind of up here about if the election result changes, do we get more revenue, et cetera, what's going to be the focus on vehicle kilometres reduction, etc. But irrespective of the changes in the political climate, the fundamentals, I think, remain the same. So watch this space and expect an interesting 2023. So I'm going to go through the final part of the presentation. I'll battle through this fairly quickly, but it's just a number of key concepts that I think it's sort of useful for the committee to have in mind when thinking about, particularly around the 2024 sort of regional land transport program. So first one of those is mode neutrality. Just think about investing for outcomes, and those investments may be across a number of modes. It may be across a single mode, but sort of thinking about you're investing for outcomes, not a specific modal outcome necessarily. So next one is the Waka Kotahi intervention hierarchy, and this is really important because in the intervention hierarchy, really consideration to integrated planning and basically getting your land use planning right comes top there. The next item on the list is about managing demand, and there's an item further down on your agenda about that, about travel demand management, and that's a really important tool for helping to help to manage the network. It also contributes to the next part of which is making best use of the existing networks. So, and then new infrastructure really comes sort of after that once you've got your land use right, once you've done your best with managing the demand to travel and you're making best use of the networks that you already have. So this is a quick slide about transport land use integration. It just makes a distinction between accessibility and mobility. And accessibility is really about the places you can get to, and mobility is about getting accessibility by bridging distance. One focuses on getting the land use right to reduce the distance you need to travel. So focusing on accessibility. Mobility is really about responding to land use by bridging that distance. So worth keeping that in mind. And if you think about the investment on Cameron Road in Tauranga and an improved PT and cycling corridor where you can focus frequent bus service and more intensive development, delivers on the accessibility side while still providing mobility. So travel demand management coming up later in your agenda, but this is really about helping people use infrastructure in place for other modes than driving. So, and there's a whole bunch of measures, parking management, sort of Tauranga City Council's made some good steps in parking management in the city centre and working on those for other parts of Tauranga by way of example. But a key element of it in there, and I'd emphasise, for example, employer-based travel plans. It's really important, I think, for public sector agencies to lead by example. If you're expecting people to change mode of transport, it's really good to be able to demonstrate that you're doing that yourself. Dunedin's got an interesting process through the Zero Carbon Alliance there, in which all of the key employer-based players are working together on that in a collaborative model. I think that's an interesting model. So just going to talk about the drivers of mode shift to public transport. And it's in my view, one of the weird things at the moment is there's a really big emphasis on the weakest mode, what I think are the weakest mode shift drivers versus the strongest ones. And yes, it's really good that we're decarbonising our public transport fleet at quite a speed. And vehicle quality, it's not that it doesn't matter, it isn't necessarily the strongest driver of mode shift. And probably the thing I personally hate the most is sort of ride the bus type campaigns, the ones that just exhort you to good behaviour. What's really important in public transport is delivering reliability, frequency, simplicity on the incentive side, and managing parking, pricing and availability. And certainly the stronger your urban core is, and there's really good stuff in the Tauranga City Centre Action Investment Plan around Tauranga City Centre, and I know some good work in Rotorua as well. So I want to talk about size does matter when it comes to buses, and because it's one of the big questions that pops up all the time is why not smaller buses? Because you see these big buses are running around with not very many people on it. And Timaru has gone down that model. The furthest in New Zealand has effectively replaced its public transport with on demand. But while that's increased patronage in Timaru, it's actually also increased the cost per customer quite significantly. So it actually costs Timaru more per customer on the on-demand system than it did on the former conventional bus system. And it doesn't scale very well. And what it means is that there are very, very long waits in the peak for the on-demand, 30 to 40 minutes, for example. So, which is really not a turn up and go. It's a turn up and sort of wait quite a while. So smaller buses, they're only marginally cheaper than standard buses, and really buses need to be scaled to your highest demand. So if you use them for a school trip twice a day, or you're using them for peak commuting into a town or city centre for special event services, and you need that capacity, well, it's marginal cost to use that capacity outside of the peak, even but not fully utilised. So this is from a former colleague of mine when I was at Stantec, Ryan Martinson. And it really just emphasises why all ages and abilities and designing for all ages and abilities matters so much. Because if you design for most people are able to use it. If you design for a few people, a few people will use it. I mean, it seems like applied common sense, but it is kind of an important concept that if we design all ages and abilities networks, it enables better access for everybody, whether you're able or less able. On the same front, this is another great cartoon by the same person, Ryan Martinson, and it just shows that a very minor lip on an entrance to a store, may as well just be a completely insuperable barrier for somebody in a wheelchair. And so we need to kind of keep that in mind as we're going about thinking about how we plan our towns, cities, movement networks. And I have to say that the New Zealand Building Code doesn't do a very good job of that. So don't assume that achieving minimum compliance with the New Zealand Building Code necessarily delivers that level of accessibility. So for those who have been around a while will remember the 2005 Human Rights Commission inquiry into accessible land transport, which came up with the concept of the accessible journey, which is talking about all of the steps involved to get from origin to destination. And if a journey is perfect, absolutely wonderful for 99% and inaccessible for 1%, it's a 0% accessible journey because of the 1%. It's the end to end of the journey, all elements of the journey experience that matter in the accessible journey concept. And there are a number of access challenges that the Bay of Plenty experiences. And this figure, 37.5% of BOP residents don't have a driver's license. So, obviously quite a number of those people are, too young to have a license, and some are too old and have aged out of having a driver's license. But that's a quite significant portion of the population. It's around 32% in Auckland. It's, those figures are in that sort of category. The Tauranga and Rotorua bus networks provide a reasonable level of base accessibility, but outside of it, they're very thin, particularly in the Eastern Bay. Total mobility, which provides kind of lifeline access for people with disabilities, only operates in a few centres and not in Maraparakoro or Opotiki. So being aware of that, and it comes down to the fact that you can't choose a travel option that doesn't exist or isn't very good. So talk about network effects. So if you have a look on the left-hand side, there's a graph of increased ridership on the Northwestern Cycleway. And during the entire time of that graph, there were no improvements to the Northwestern Cycleway at all. The improvements that took place was the city centre cycle network, that sort of near circular loop around the city centre that you can see shown in the map on the right. It was that network that unlocked the Northwestern Cycleway. And so the concept of network effects is really around achieving connective sort of end-to-end journeys that get you at least close to your destination, and particularly focused on cycling, but the same effect operates for public transport. And this is a Tauranga example of exactly the same thing, how accessible street through Otomotai Peninsula, how that will make a really big difference by providing connective networks end-to-end in journeys. So the work that Tauranga City Council is doing with accessible streets and Saiway and Rotorua are really good pieces of work. So in summary, invest for outcomes, not mode. Land use planning informs and actually to a large extent drives transport requirements. to get motion for public transport, you really want simple, frequent, reliable services. These are the base elements. That's the thing that really should be the focus. Inclusive access is fundamental and benefits everyone. If something's more accessible, it makes everyone more accessible, including people with accessibility challenges. And don't forget about baseline access for rural areas. Public transport's not just an urban issue, and complete networks are essential for growth and active modes, and I'd say for public transport as well. And I think, quick slide. This is obviously from sort of cobbled together from your agenda. The Regional Transport Committee has a crucial role in that, in the preparation of the Regional Land Transport Programme, what activities go in there, coordinating transport and land use, note underlying strategies and plans, because getting the land use right is so important, and your advocacy role to central government. And that's me. So if anyone's got any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Excellent report, Darren. There's a lot there to digest. I think it may have been easier to have taken questions through it, because you're now going to have to drive your own presentation, because I know colleagues are going to want to refer to specific slides. So get ready for that. So colleagues on Zoom, colleagues at the table, questions or points of clarification from Darren. So the floor is Worship Mayor Luca.
I've got a few questions, but you showed a diagram with a little box for resilience. And you talked about Build Back Better.
Yeah.
The latest cyclone event has knocked out about 30 bridges in Hawke's Bay and Gisborne area. They're all bridges with pillars down the middle, support structures. I presume when you're talking about Build Back Better, you're talking about better, more resilient bridge design. I mean, we've been after a bridge in Whakatane for quite a while. My main argument was resilience. We're still stuck with the same old bridge. Traffic density's increased, and the escape routes out of town are the same. The traffic density's increased by a factor of 4 over the last few years. We can't get a bridge. What about resilient bridge design? What's the thinking there?
Well, I think that's going to be a real focus, and I think it's really become front and centre. As I said, it's incredibly front of mind in Napier and Hastings at the moment. The loss of, I think, sort of 3 out of the 5 bridge connections between the two, and it's an issue that Ashburton's had with the crossing of the Ashburton River, and working on a second crossing for the Ashburton River for exactly that same reason. And part of the response to resilience is about route choice. It's about alternative routes in case one route is disrupted, because we've seen the impact of the Coromandel being completely cut off from the rest of New Zealand for periods of time, the Mungamunga Gorge in Northland, Manawatu Gorge, the Kaikoura earthquakes. We're seeing really huge resilience impacts, and just massive cost increases to the freight industry in particular, and the supply chains that come from that.
Questions, colleagues?
I have a second.
Go. It's supplementary, Your Worship. Go.
You showed a diagram that had road fatalities and road deaths as a function of time starting from 2001. I've got some data that dates back to 1925.
Okay.
It's on a pretty dramatic decline and actually hits a sort of an asymptote at around the 2000 mark. What do you think the primary factors are that are responsible? In fact, the road deaths from 2021 look pretty flat. I only got a quick glimpse of it. Which is consistent with hitting some sort of asymptote. But what do you think is responsible for that steeply declining curve?
Okay,
from 1925.
Oh, and I remember when it peaked in the late 1970s, and there's a lot of elements to it. There was the safety of vehicles. There was a rather laxer attitude to drinking and driving. There really hadn't been much enforcement. Seatbelts only became mandatory in the front seat in the early 1970s, and later in the back seat. And so there's a whole bunch of factors. So safer vehicles, probably a move to a better approach to speed management. I remember back in the day, nobody took any notice of 50k zones driving through towns. They slowed down a little bit, but there were no speed cameras or red light cameras, or anything like that. So there's been a whole variety of measures. So the point's well made that even where we are now is much better than where we were sort of back in the day. But the slightly disturbing thing is the trend is starting to go in the wrong direction after quite a number of years of significant improvement.
Well, the fatalities trend is not really going the wrong way. It looks pretty flat. I don't know what the uncertainties on that data is, but
that's across the nation, it's going up. And,
okay, so that's just a bad thing.
Yeah.
So we're doing really well.
Well, you don't really want to kill anyone in the transport network.
No, but the question is how much investment you need to put in to save a life, and what's a reasonable amount? Because you've hit a flat limit. I would argue that the major factor that's controlled the reduction in road deaths is car safety. All the safety features that have been built in over the years and continue to be built in, and I think that's where the savings are going to come. You've got anti-crash, high-tech gizmos now in cars that will make the cars of the future virtually impossible to crash.
And that's fine if you're in a vehicle, but if you're outside a vehicle as a cyclist or on a scooter or as a pedestrian, you're probably more vulnerable, simply because the vehicles are heavier. With SUVs, the centre of gravity is higher, and the damage they do that when they hit a pedestrian or a cyclist is more. So yes, for people inside vehicles, but we need to consider the safety of people outside of vehicles as well.
It's worship Mayor Daniel.
Thank you. Just following up some of the data there, that gives injuries and deaths in absolute terms per year.
Yeah.
I think the more useful analysis would be deaths per kilometre travelled. And for example, I know that the traffic counts and volumes increased markedly in my part of the world, at least from about 2016 onwards, and that obviously coincides with the that rise in the serious injuries. So how much of that rise is a function of increased traffic, and how much is it other factors?
Yeah, but remembering that a lot of the time that the trend was going down were times of significant economic growth as well, that even while traffic volumes were increasing, the trauma in the transport network was reducing, and there is a relationship between the two. And I always use the example of Detroit, which, because there was a significant economic collapse and migration out of the city, traffic volume significantly decreased, and so did economic activity. And so you really don't want to get, achieve your outcomes through not having a vibrant economy. So I think it's just important to because there's two elements to it. There's kind of your exposure to trauma, and then there's the total amount of trauma, the likelihood that you as an individual are going to be subject to personal risk versus the collective risk across the network. And so for example, you'll have routes in the network that have sort of relatively low collective risk, but will have quite high sort of personal risk just because of how they are in the network.
Councillor McMillan, come and use the microphone next to Darren, and then we go to Commissioner Selwyn. Councillor McMillan, question.
Sure. I was just interested in you talking about the bus size. So we've had a lot of feedback from the community about bus size, and seems to be quite a drive towards smaller buses for sort of access of routes in tricky areas, and bigger buses carving up roads and things in those sort of tight corner areas. Do you think that there is a sweet spot of a blend of size of buses, or are you advocating that we just go for maximum capacity and drive all the other factors and get them filled?
Partly horses for courses. So, for example, if you're wanting to use a bus as a school bus, or you're wanting to use it for special events, or you've got a big peak demand, then you probably need a big bus for that. If you've got sort of more localized demands to travel, where that demand's relatively stable and the roading network's more challenging, streets are narrower, etc., or in rural context, smaller, may be fine. So there is an element of horses for courses for it, and I think the principle remains that you really want to think of what your peak is. That's been the challenge with on demand in Timaru and other places, that it's good where there's this relatively stable demand from people with particularly people sort of more intense needs from the public transport system, because it actually provides better for them, but it doesn't scale very well. So if the demand increases, your costs increase very substantially.
Okay, thank you.
Really, Mr. Chair, just in addition to that question, in terms of operating the passenger transport network, we are driving sort of efficiency in the way that we use those types of things, of buses and small buses and bigger ones. And if we're going out to market our suppliers to provide a service, quite often a bigger bus is a better option for them, and they come to us with proposals that look like that. So sometimes we'll see those buses on there, and they are, from an efficiency perspective and the ratepayer dollar perspective, more efficient for us to do it that way, notwithstanding some of those effects that you described.
Yeah, and you're also more likely to achieve mode shift outside of the peak by improving frequency. And if you've got the capacity to take that demand, within your existing fleet, that's a good thing.
Okay, this is the batting order. Commissioner Selwood, David Spears, and the Honourable Ken Shirley. Commissioner.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Darren. I thought it was a very thorough overview of all of the challenges that we face, and the opportunities for that matter. You emphasised urban form and urban density, and obviously related to the potential for mode shift. And I totally agree, urban form is one of the key levers that we need to pull. The problem is that it's really slow and it's really expensive. We need about another 3,000 homes a year in Tauranga, and we're actually a mile away from achieving that. And we need that to be targeted at corridors that we can provide a high quality public transport service to really shift mode. And one of our problems, this is really an observation, one of our problems is that we're targeting urban density and densification everywhere, which is the latest government policy. And that is really expensive to provide a viable public transport connection. So I'm interested in your thoughts about, if you were to prioritise urban form in the connection with public transport in the context of Tauranga and our region, where would you?
On your major PG routes,
Which are?
say Cameron Road, for example, out to the Mount, out towards Bayfair and Papamoa. So concentrate on the routes where you can provide frequency. And I personally share that concern. The risk of having sort of, you could almost hit the really bad spot of density where you get too much density that puts a lot of traffic on the network, but not enough to support really strong public transport.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the dilemma we're facing if we aren't targeted and efficient in our investment. If I may, Chair, another question.
Certainly.
Because I thought you were quite light on the funding question, and actually
It's a fun question.
in the room. We all know that there's not enough money to invest at the pace and scale, both in public transport services and roading and transport generally, at the level required to support the pace of growth for the region and for the city. So, Chair, my view is, unless we deal with this funding issue, we're kind of going to be perpetually moving the chairs around the Titanic. And that seems to be the sort of trend of government policy statements of recent times. We're going we've only got a certain amount of money, so we'll prioritise this time and we'll prioritise that next time. And you can even see it in the discussion that's just happened in the media in the last 2 or 3 days. You've also, and Darren, you focused on parking pricing. And I think that is an important piece of the pie, if you like, to encourage mode shift and kind of be the stimulus for people to think about, actually, can I travel a different way? But you didn't focus on pricing the network, pricing the wider network. And members will know that that's a strong issue for me, and one that I want to see us progress in the time, certainly that the commissioners are here, and certainly within the 10-year time frame of our RLTP, because if we don't, we're not going to be using the network optimally, and we're not going to have enough money to be able to invest in the capacity improvements that we require either public transport or roading, walking and cycling. And we won't be changing the behaviour in the way that is needed to actually get a transformative change or carbon emissions. So we're constantly talking about the problem, but never really wanting to grasp the nettle. And I'm actually going to be a strong advocate this year as we put our RLTP together, that we have to grasp the nettle on both pricing the network and funding the level of investment that's required. Because if we don't, I can't see us making much difference.
If I can just make a couple of quick comments about that. Really obvious issue and the clear signals from government is that in the next NLTP period, there'll be sort of carryovers and cost escalations from projects that are committed. So the commitments will be a big part of the program. There'll be a big focus on resilience, for very obvious reasons from recent extreme weather events, some on maintenance and some on road safety, and not likely to be very much for anything else. And as you saw, we got to a stage where it's only the NLTF, the National Land Transport Fund's only funding 55% of the transport investment. A lot more of the investments coming up from one-off Crown grants or from different sources. And it really is a question we haven't confronted fully around the pricing question. That's certainly feedback I've offered in my challenge team role for the National VKT sort of reduction plan is around that exact issue, is to get VKT reduction at the scale that the government is envisaging requires really great other choices than driving, and combined with those pricing measures, there's a mixture of carrots and sticks. And I'm not totally convinced that the appetite's there as yet, but certainly worth keeping that on the radar.
Thanks, Commissioner. David, have you taken your hand down? Okay, right. Honourable Ken Shirley, then Her Worship Mayor Tatson.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to pick up one of my colleague, Councillor McMillan, raised with regard to the impact of heavy buses on the network and the damage. And it is a nationwide issue and problems, local governments incurring considerable costs because of the damage that occurs. It comes back to the VDAM rule, the Vehicle Dimension and Mass Rule under the Land Transport Act. And it's set for a very reason. Roads are really and bridges, they're cakes of salt. They're designed to be used and worn, but you've got to use and wear them at an affordable rate of replacement. And that's why the VDAM rule sets it very specifically at about, I think from memory, it's 7 tonne per axle. And that's why when we had a 44 tonne limit on heavy trucks, when we went to 50 tonne, we had to go to 9 axles. And that's for the impact on pavements and structures. But government, in its, I was going to say wisdom, but it's the wrong word, gave an exemption to buses. So buses are having an impact on pavements and structures that technically is excessive of what we know is the design affordable rate of wear and tear. And local government wears the brunt of that. So I'd just like your comment on what's the logic of that and what work's been done to actually correct what is a gross anomaly and a distortion.
I'll comment within the level of my knowledge. It's not totally in my area of expertise, but the issue really with electric buses is, as I understand it, around the weight of the battery, particularly generally around the rear axle of the bus, depending on where it's located. It's been a reason, for example, that we haven't yet got double-decker electric buses in New Zealand because of that. I'm not the greatest technical expert on this, but I suspect that as the technology improves, that the batteries will become much less heavy and that issue would go away. But it was interesting that Wellington moved away from having trolley buses, which don't have that issue, to sort of battery electric buses, which do. Because of course trolley buses, they draw their power, straight from overhead wires, and so in terms of the mechanics and weight, they're much lighter. But yeah, I mean, it is a real issue, and I know that Tauranga City Councils, and other road controlling authorities have that issue in their mind as well.
Her Worship Mayor Tatson. Her Worship Mayor Tatson, then His Worship Mayor Luca. Mayor Tatson.
Thank you very much, and good morning. Thank you for your presentation. My questions kind of form around the funding, and especially the limited funding that you talked about. As mentioned, Rotorua has a severe housing shortage. That is not new across the Bay of Plenty. As we saw, many people found out how beautiful the Bay of Plenty is to live, but also we have a lot of commuters between our different TLA areas, because of course they have to find a house that they can afford and a job that they can actually get to. So in terms of land use, which I really appreciated some of your points and your values that were emphasised in there, one of the key issues that we have is actually unlocking that land for new residential development. And of course, with the limited funding that we have as local government, at what point are we going to look at that limited funding and say, okay, well, this model needs to shift? Because 90% of public expenditure here in New Zealand is decided by the government. And so we are not left with very money regardless. So I take on Commissioner Selwood's points around we need to look at how we can not only get more revenue, but at what point are we actually going to look at and say, when we do have such growth issues across not only Bay of Plenty region, but across the country, will we start doing or taking some action on what many of us have talked about for a very long time, that local TLAs are just simply not funded appropriately to be able to unlock that land. And so instead of going every single year or every single term and asking at the grace of whatever minister at the time, if we could please have some more funding to unlock the plans that we have had in place, future development strategies, infrastructure strategies, will we start pushing a bit harder on those conversations too?
Yeah, it's interesting because you think we have a National Land Transport Fund and a National Land Transport Program, but we don't necessarily have anything analogous for housing. I mean, we do through the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development and Kaingaora to an extent, and it's it's a very real issue. But any of you working in local government, you'll know this is a very centralised country by global standards, and there are lots of mandates that come from central government that create lots and lots of work for regional and local governments to deal with without necessarily the resources to do that, which so these are really big challenges for local and regional government in this country. And I've seen this in the work that I've done in Tauranga, that the staff that are involved are really great, but they're stretched across multiple different things. And I think you're right. There needs to be more of a focus on how central government sort of partners with enabling more sustainable urban development and addressing the housing shortfalls in many New Zealand centres. There's an example in Queenstown. So everywhere in New Zealand has a bus driver shortage. So Otago Regional Council's managed to recruit about 22 bus drivers from the Philippines there. But the only place they could find to house them was in Cromwell. So those bus drivers have a 120-kilometre commute, 60 kilometres each way, just to get to work. And you're getting really extreme issues like that. You've got people who are building houses in Jack's Point who are coming from Lumsden and have to drive an hour each way. So, the housing issues are driving sort of really bad transport outcomes, and those are driving really bad outcomes for the people who's subject to those long commutes. It impacts on quality of life, it impacts on your transport costs, and impacts on how much time you get to spend with your friends and family. So I think they're all very real issues.
It's worship near Luca.
Yeah, I'm just playing off what Commissioner Selwood was saying and lamenting the fact that funding hasn't been discussed, or we've got this funding problem. And I think the fundamental problem is we don't understand growth. And I made those comments at the last meeting. So 2% growth means that every 35 years you're doubling the population. So you need to build out the infrastructure. And we need to build an infrastructure, you have to be able to pay for it. That situation seems to me is not getting any better, it's only getting worse. I look at our district and I look at the roads we have, where the population has doubled, the number of cars on the road have doubled, and yet the roads are all the same as they always were. So I'm interested in data, and I'd like to know if we have any data around the kilometres of new roading that have been built per head of population over time, just to see if we really have dropped the ball, as I suspect. I wonder if I can get that data off you sometime.
Oh, I'm sure
You've probably got it.
I'm sure that the regional council can assist with that, or even territorial local authorities themselves. But the observation's well made. There's been very significant increases in population in the high growth regions of New Zealand without significant increases in the transport infrastructure by all modes to support that. And this country, in my view, has a really big infrastructure deficit. We really do. And for a long time, we've never really confronted that as a nation. So, yeah, I mean, absolutely. And unless we provide great other choices than driving, you know, people are going to drive and they're going to drive in increasingly worse conditions.
Yeah, and the only thing I hear from the government is there's never any money for anything, but there used to be once.
Any final comments or questions, colleagues? Thank you, Darren. Brilliant presentation. Great amount of material that you brought to us there today. And I'll move that we receive that presentation with grateful thanks. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. Oliver. And we need a second. The Commissioner Selwell will second that. Okay. Oliver, welcome. Good to have you here. Just lead us through the chairperson's report. There's a couple of key items there. And will you also do the road safety update from the sub-regions? Yeah. The mayors may have a comment about their particular areas, but I know it's for information. But over to you.
So members, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll broadly take this report to the red, but just go over some of the salient points. So first up in the report, we have an update on the Bay of Plenty Transport Emission Reduction Plan. Broadly speaking, we are trying to understand the policy, or changing policy landscape in which the TUP sits, most notably the evolving position on BKT. The second item in the Chair's report digs down into the BKT aspects in a bit more detail, and I know quite recently this committee has asked for some clarification around sort of the BKT reduction targets and the sort of emerging position in a Bay of Plenty context. So that just clarifies that that 20% reduction for tier 1 areas, of which Tauranga is one, compared to the baseline projections for 2035. And that broadly means that that's a 1% real reduction compared to 2019 levels. In relation to the road safety update, that report is attached, and more than happy for others to provide any input on that. But that just provides a strategic high-level update on the road safety activities that have been ongoing around the sub-region of late. I was taking questions.
As Oliver said, the Regional Road Safety Report comes to this committee from the various sub-regions. So I don't know if the mayors wish to comment on their particular areas in terms of road safety or how it's going. And I'll move we receive the report, seconded by Her Worship Mayor Tapsell. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. David and Jessica. Where have you gone, David? There he is.
Kia ora.
Welcome. Good to have you with us.
Yeah, apologies.
So we're in your hands. A very detailed report, and I know there'll be a lot of interest in it. And I know you'll touch on the bridges in Whakatane for Mayor Luke. I know that's contained in your report. So over to you.
So, Jess, is there in person today?
Jessica,
David's going to do most of it, and we've also got Fabian Marsh here, who is going to do the road safety update.
Okay, welcome, Fabian.
So, Mr. Chair, just checking everybody can hear me okay. We'll take the report as read with your grace, and just quickly run through the presentation. There's deliberately a section of sort of nationally relevant slides, and then some local slides. And as Jess said, Fabian's going to talk about road safety at the end of the presentation. So, first of all, just to touch on the NLTP, because we were starting to talk about funding and there not being enough. Towards the end of last year, the board reviewed the investment targets in the NLTP, and they're set out there for you in the graph, or the graphic equalizer, as I like to call it, and made some changes. And those changes were based on demand for funding from the various investment targets, but also on the actuality of delivery. and there's a range of reasons that delivery has been a bit variable compared to what we thought across both ourselves and local government. COVID, supply chains, labour market issues, etc. And what that's meant is that we're unlikely to deliver on quite a few actually of the targets. Unfortunately, councils have delayed starting new projects, as have we. They're being delivered at a slower rate. What that's enabled, or what that's meant, is that the board have been able to shift some of the targets, and what you'll see is the really big shifts are around public transport services, but also state highway maintenance, where the targets have been lifted relative to what was in the NLTP.
David, just pause one moment. I know you always accept questions throughout the presentation. There's some pretty meaty issues you're going to cover here, and a lot of it doesn't make wonderful reading. But if you're happy with that,
by all means.
You are, Colin. So let's focus on the key slides, and I'll take questions throughout the presentation. Go for it, David.
So on that, what essentially what that means is we are likely to have quite a few carryover targets into the 24-27 NLTP. It's unlikely that we will be able to fund any new activities. And as you'll know, in the NLTP process, we have funded probable and possible categories. It's almost certain that we won't be able to fund any of the possible activities. So, the things that ended up on the end of the list, that if there's funding available, we'll be able to fund them. We will be able to fund what is planned for now, but bearing in mind that, going into the next NLTP process, some of that will carry over, which means we'll have an enormous task ahead of us rationalising that carryover. Probably don't need to say much more than that, unless Jess wants to add anything.
I think I'd just clarify on the statement, new activities, things that are marked as probable in the NLT now does not mean they were funded, and you will find almost all of that will, if you put an application now, will not be funded. So if it's not underway, the chance of funding it going forward is extremely low.
Okay. Now, Darren's actually done a really good job of touching on many of the things that were in this presentation, and one of them was, very briefly at least, the indicative strategic priorities for the GPS. As you'll all know, the GPS process has been delayed while government go back, and I think in light of recent events, unsurprisingly, go back and have a look at what it is they want to prioritise in the next GPS review, which means that it'll be April, May this year before we're consulting on a version of an updated GPS for 2024. That said, the fundamentals remain the same. The strategic priorities are not likely to change. What will change is the extent to which government wants to invest in those strategic priorities. Integrated freight system, safe transport system, resilience is probably the one that we are, it's not probably, it's definitely the one that we are going to see a bigger focus on. Maintaining and operating the system, I suspect, will be one we'll see a greater focus on, and sustainable urban development. We don't have any really strong signals at the moment about what is likely to come out of that review that Ministry of Transport are leading at the moment, but we are front and centre and amongst the conversation, particularly in the space of resilience and what does it mean to maintain and operate the system at the moment. I'll just pick up on one of the questions, or one of the comments perhaps. There's a little bit of danger in the rhetoric around Build Back Better, and just want to be really clear that that's not necessarily a signal that we will be building 4-lane highways everywhere, or that we will be, building enormous, great big single-span bridges across the country. Build Back Better is the combination of, can we make the existing infrastructure safer? Can we make the existing infrastructure more resilient to damage? And what are the alternative routes and the alternative solutions that we can put in place in some of these places, like the Coromandel, for example? So just a little bit of, caution that some of what I'm hearing is people saying, oh, right, Build Back Better, we'll have a new road before, 2027. That's extremely unlikely. It's much, much more likely that Build Back Better means we will look at alternative routes. We will look at strengthening the systems we've got. And where it is necessary to bypass areas, then we will, but only on a necessity basis. Just touching on safe system audit guidelines, I've talked about this before, but just to say that the new safe system audit guidelines were released in May 2013. The new ones replace those May 2013 standards, and so it's quite timely. Your technical folk will be all over this. They will have been involved. We're involved in the development of the audit guidelines and will be very familiar with them. But just to say, they're updated. They're picking up guidance around new road safety issues, particularly, and will be applied to all of the 2024-27 NLTP projects. Next slide, vehicle safety ratings. Again, this is just an update, really. The latest safety ratings are out. My son is currently looking for a car and expressed his frustration to me the other day that, he can't find a car that meets a 5-star safety rating. It took me all of about 15 minutes to find half a dozen models of car that he can afford in the under $10,000 range that meet a 5-star safety rating. But the thing that we have to remember is every single time we update these, what was a 5-star car 5 years ago becomes a 3-star or a 2-star or a 4-star because of the technology. The key thing in these latest safety ratings is they now include the crash avoidance technology in imported cars, which wasn't the case up until this review. So it's if you jump on the Right Car website, you'll find it's much more thorough now in terms of what vehicle safety ratings are reliable. And you'll have heard me say before that one of the things Ministry of Transport are working on at the moment is legislative change to limit, if not stop, the importation of 1- and 2-star rated cars into New Zealand. And the third bullet point there, self-explanatory, really tells you why you are twice as likely to survive in a 5-star rated car than in a 1- or 2-star rated car if you have a at-speed collision. VKT reduction planning, I'm not even going to talk about this because Darren did such a good job of covering it.
David, just pause for one moment. We have a question from Councillor Nees. Councillor Nees, you're there in the ether region somewhere.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Sorry, I've just been thinking about, and your presentation's moved on, David, from the issue I wanted to talk about, but thinking about the restrictions and funding that you're signalling, and aware that MOT is doing quite a bit of work on looking at transport funding, that could pop out at any time. And I'm just thinking about the implications for our regional land transport plan and the thinking that we need to do. It's a 3-year plan, but a lot might change in the term of the plan. So I'm just a bit concerned that you're sending signals which is sort of discouraging us from being ambitious with asking for funding for projects that are absolutely essential to deal with our urban growth targets, etc. So can you just give me some feedback as to what approach we should be taking for our regional land transport plan? Should we be asking for what we really need, i.e. to meet our MPS for urban development capacity, to meet our mode shift to ensure we've got resilience in our network? Or should we be assuming that the government's going to address the funding shortfall by some major review in funding? I just think we've got to be very future focused in our regional land transport plan, and I'm worried about the signals that you're sending us that we might just be tempted to sit on our hands and say, well, there's no money, so let's not ask for what we really need.
Yeah, look, I think there's two different things there, Councillor Nees. One is our current reality, and our current reality is that we have an envelope of funding available to us, and we have a a series of projects and funding expectations to meet, and we do not have the funding to meet everything that is in the NLTP in terms of, as Jess said, the probables and possibles. That's our current funding reality. Looking forward, if the funding reality we're in now stays the same, then we won't have, well, we won't have significant more money. That does not mean that we should not be ambitious in what we want to invest in. And I think that would be really, really dangerous, because we don't know what the outcome of this GPS review is going to be. We don't know what investment priority government is going to take into the next NLTP. We don't know outside of the NLTP what other funding sources there will be. And as Darren touched on, the NLTP increasingly is becoming a part of the funding for transport, not all of it. So I think if we were overly conservative and we weren't ambitious in what we prioritise and want funded, that would be a massive mistake. I do think we need to be realistic and very, very careful that the things we prioritise in our RLTP are the genuine priorities, because we may only get, the top 10 or the top 12, but that's not a reason not to have 20 or 30 things that we would really like to fund.
David, just pause a moment. Commissioner Selwood.
Thank you, Councillor Nees, and thank you, David. I think you've really answered the question properly. If we constrain our thinking to the available budget, we'll never solve the problem.
Exactly.
And so we have to look at what we need and then figure out how we fund it. And if we've got short-term funding constraints, then so be it, we will prioritise. But the number one priority for us is figuring out how we can fund the level of investment that's required to support the growth and development of the region. I have a question on the reduction, VKT reduction planning, if I may, Chair. I understand, David, that the regional targets will be published shortly and will be open to submissions. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. I raise that because I think it's really important that when we make submissions on the VKT targets, we make it very clear that VKT is only a proxy for carbon reduction. And actually what we should be measuring and monitoring is carbon reduction. Because the reality is, notwithstanding our best hopes and aspirations in the world, in Tauranga City, we are facing a 17% increase in jobs over the next decade, a 19% increase in homes, and we're expected to hold our VKT at, well, drop it by, I think, 1%, or basically have no increase in VKT.
Yep.
And although that may well be laudable, and it is laudable, the practicality of actually delivering that is beyond, well, certainly beyond me, and if anyone's got the answer, I'd love to hear it. What we really need to be targeting is that carbon emissions are too high, and we need to reduce those and focus our efforts on that outcome, of which reduction of VKT will be part, but is only part. Alternative fuels is a major component, and the speed with which we can achieve that. Mode shift is obviously part of the VKT story, but I come back to pricing signals and all of those other issues or other interventions that we can use. And the goal is reducing carbon, because we have to be real, that VKT by 20%. Look, to be honest, I think it's unrealistic, and I think we need to be clear in our submissions on that very message.
The questions keep going, David.
Okay, national ticketing solution. So just an update, really. We've talked about this previously, but we are making good progress on rolling out the national ticketing solution. First cab off the rank, so to speak, will be Environment Canterbury next year. And all of the other regions, including Bay of Plenty Regional Council, will be rolled out by 2026. Key thing here is no matter where you are in the country, there is one solution. The other really key thing to this actually is from a data gathering point of view, there will be one source of data, one source of truth on passenger usage, passenger trends, etc. Whereas at the moment, every council holds its own data, depending on the system they use, etc. So really positive move, and it's making progress quite well at the moment. Just the last kind of national program that I wanted to highlight, because we've talked about this before, and it's very relevant, I think, to the Bay of Plenty, particularly in Portiki and some of our other more far-flung areas, is the driver's license improvement program. That was an initiative that was started back in 2022 to try and address what was increasingly becoming an issue around accessibility of driver's licenses. They were very expensive. There were lots of barriers to young people being able to access testing, let alone training for a driver's license. And so working with Ministry of Social Development, Police, Te Puni Kōkiri, etc., we came up with a couple of trial programs, and in the far north particularly, that's been implemented really well, to try and work out, what are the barriers to young people, well, to any people accessing a driver's license, so that we get away from the situation where we have people who just drive anyway, or who drive an unlicensed vehicle, and end up interacting with Stu's team in a way that really can be avoided. So that program has progressed really well. It is going to roll out across the rest of the country. Part of the challenge is, at the moment, driver's license testing is an economic model run through VTNZ and AA. And so there's a sort of a fine line between where you establish community-led programs that are not profit, that are not profit driven, and avoid undermining those organizations in the larger cities, for example, that are doing a really good job. So it will roll out, but it will roll out in a very targeted way over the next couple of years. Suffice to say, it's been very successful in Northland, and I think with the cooperation of police and MSD particularly, it's been well received in that community. Stu, I don't know if you know anything more about that from a police point of view, but certainly our view is that it's been very successful.
No, I can only comment that we'll support any initiative that helps people get their driver license, get mobile, be able to get employment, go from A to B safely.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think this is a great initiative, and I just want to highlight an example in our part of the world. So we put a licensing centre into Puki Library, and that's a huge benefit. I'm from Karikari. We're going to try and do that at some point, so put it in the Karikari Library as well. But I've gone through this with my son. At the moment, you're at school, you can't access it during the week, during the school week. So you need to go to Tauranga. There's no bus to get you to the licensing centre on the weekends from Karikari. It's the irony there is significant. So let's remove these barriers as much as we can.
Honourable Ken Shirley.
Yes, David, on the licensing, just referring to the heavy licensing, stage 5, with the chronic shortages in freight for trucks and also public transport for buses, there's been quite an issue for a number of years about the duration and the time of length to qualify in the distance centre, particularly for younger people, actually very good drivers generally in the heavy sector. And I'm just wondering whether there's been any progress in streamlining that. I know there's a lot of push over a number of years to try and streamline it, because attaining the licence is just the starting point. It's actually the training and the support that follows that really the real value is. But if you've got an excessive time in actually getting the licence as the starting point, it is a serious disincentive, and I believe it has been for some time. Could you comment on that?
I can. So there's been a small legislative change to that process, which now enables that second stage of the licensing to be done on the job rather than pre having a job. So up till now, you, as you said, you get your license, and then there's a second stage which you have to do before you are able to work, if you like, or attain your full license. That piece of legislation's been changed now, so that it's almost like an apprenticeship kind of approach. So you can actually get those hours as you are working. You have to work under supervision, and there are some supervision limitations around that. But that was identified with the freight industry as being one of the biggest barriers to the driver shortage that we've got. And so yes, so that's been changed to try and address that. It's only a recent change, but it should have quite a big effect quite quickly.
So we on the Bay of Plenty update?
Yeah, that's right. So Bay of Plenty updates, not too much today, and I might, as we get further along, I might sort of hand over to Jess on a couple of these. But Takitimu North Link, there's just a little photo montage and a video here, which is quite interesting and reassuring. So we're making really good progress on Takitimu North Link Stage 1. We're 1 year into construction. Things are progressing reasonably well considering the horror summer that we've had. And if we can play the video, it was filmed in December, but it just gives you a really nice little update into where we are in terms of progress.
Jessica.
Amanda has.
Amanda.
We might just come back to that one, David, by Amanda.
Not working? Okay.
Do you know which slide the video is? I think we might need to move on from that.
It's on slide 12, Amanda, and it's got a nice little arrow, but we can move on if it's not going to work. That's it. That's the one. It's just a drone flyover that gives you a sense. I find it quite helpful because it puts it spatially in place.
Should be sound as well.
There should be sound with it.
Do you want to give a running commentary, David?
Well, there's Cambridge Road. Well, I think the key thing is it gives you a sense of the scale of works that are occurring. The bridge work to go past Cambridge Road is almost complete, and we'll start. We contractors will start the process of pushing through there in the next little while. The temporary bridge over the Wairoa is in place, and that temporary bridge allows the trucks to go across while we are building the main bridge. And you'll see the two sort of groins sticking out from that temporary bridge. Those are the staging posts for the cranes to sit on while they place the bridge spans. And you remember that's an enormous bridge, and I'll show you a picture in a minute that explains why the bridge is so big, 300 meters. Wairoa Road diversion. So this is where we're going to go under the road, and you'll see the bridge spans there at the bottom, very bottom of the picture at the moment, ready to go. Considering the weather they've had, they've made an enormous amount of progress and are more or less on target at the moment. And we're coming down now to Te Miti Valley and down to where we'll link on to the existing road in anticipation of one day building stage 2. I've seen this a few times and I can't remember the commentary, sorry. So essentially just beyond the project office is where the tie-in will occur back into Starawe 2. Yeah, right there at Loop Road. I think that's the video, Amanda.
Keep talking to your report, David.
Right, so back to the slides. Next slide is just a picture of the Wairua River Bridge. This is pre-anniversary weekend. And then the next slide is during the flood event that occurred. Same site, 29th to the 1st at 9:30 in the morning. And the slide after is the same day at 6 p.m. So the water came a very long way, but fortunately drained away reasonably quickly, did very, very little damage, and the teams were able to get back onto the site relatively quickly. Now, the reason for showing that slide is in the next slide, we talk a little bit about resilience. The design of the Wairua Bridge, deliberately 355 meters long above the floodplain, is for the very reason that is demonstrated in those two previous pictures. So the river in that event peaked twice, enormous flows, 700 and 800 cubic meters a second. Now, those were 10-year flows compared to the 100-year flow, which is the design flow for the bridge. So the bridge is designed to easily cope and span those flood events, but it's quite a nice, timely kind of reminder of why we're building such a big piece of infrastructure to cross that river. Next slide, Takatumi North Link, Stage 2, Te Puna to Mokoroa. So at the moment, we're just going through the process of reviewing and updating the alternative highway alignment assessments. We have an emerging preferred alignment, and we're working with key stakeholders and landowners on that at the moment, including the department and District Council, Department of Conservation, and hope to lodge the requirement to protect that route in late 2023. Obviously, there's quite a lot of challenges no matter which route we take, and at the moment we have really, really good alignment between local iwi and the Department of Conservation and our expectations of a route. So yeah, pretty happy with how that's progressing at this stage. Jess, do you want to...
David, just pause for one moment. Glenn?
Oh, sorry. I don't know, not so much on Takatumi North, but on the connecting mount. Are you going to?
Let's deal with the Northern Link first. So, any other questions or comments? Anyone? Mayor Den, anything you want to say? We're not getting much good news here today. But...
I had that fly through with David in Chambers fairly recently, I think. So I'll witness.
Yeah, you heard the commentary.
Okay, moving on.
Right,
let's move to the Mountain Hewletts Road.
Jess, I wonder if you want to talk about Tauriko connections.
Absolutely. So Tauriko Network Connections is there's two pieces obviously happening there. We have the enabling works, which is the 3 key intersection improvements to open up the first 2,000 homes at Tauriko and with TCC. That is going to procurement this month. So we're just starting conversations with the market at the moment, and that will be going out to get contractors on board. So that's a really exciting milestone on that, and you'll see us working towards hopefully getting some diggers in at the end of the year. The longer term business case is now at the point of tidying up and completing the business case, looking to do that on the preferred option that has been publicly consulted on, so that as the community is expecting, and we're looking to go through kind of endorsement processes to the last hurdle being our board in August this year. So that will allow that to be closed down and us to seek funding for root protection and next steps through the next NLTP process.
Pause, Jessica. Commissioner Selwell.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Jess. It's great to hear that progress on the both the short-term and long-term options are progressing. Do we have any oversight as to the timeline for the offline construction being completed?
We're doing updated work at the moment for the timing on that and what the ideal timing would be. So I don't have that yet. We're just waiting on modelling results and then a conversation with your staff to lock that down. And I think we'll come back and be able to provide an update on that both to the commissioners and to RTC at the next RTC.
And yes, I raise it, Chair, because I think it's really important that the timeline for State Highway 29 upgrade is accelerated. It's great to see the progress on State Highway 2, and it was much needed. A terrible safety record on that road, and we will have a much better outcome. The State Highway 29 currently carries more traffic than State Highway 2 that we're investing a huge amount of money into. And by the time you add on State Highway 36, where it joins at the crossing or the roundabout to Takitimu Drive, it carries 36,000 vehicles, which is half as much again as State Highway 2. So, and that pressure is growing enormously. The enabling works will allow another 2,000 homes to go into Tauriko West. There's actually potential for 4,000 or more homes in Tauriko West, but that can't be enabled until the offline option is in fact delivered. We were looking very seriously as a council at putting an infrastructure funding and financing solution to enable the infrastructure investment to speed up and hasten housing development in Tauriko West. But that fell through simply because we weren't able to put enough houses in there to get a reasonable IFF levy, which has meant that we've had to look at either balance sheet funding of the underwrite of the infrastructure, or coming to an agreement, which I'm pleased to say it looks like we may do with the development community to at least fund the 2,000 homes. But they were actually at question because of the ability to fund the wider infrastructure. State Highway 29 also potentially enables us to develop all of the land up behind the crossing. And potentially there's another 25 to 30,000 homes in that area. There's already 10,000 jobs at the Tauriko Business Estate, and it's going to go to 15,000 jobs in a relatively short time. So we've got an opportunity to actually enable sort of land use that we were talking about earlier, of integrating where people live with where they work in that particular area. But all of that is conditional really on State Highway 29 offline being accelerated, because that will enable the former state, or the existing State Highway 29 alignment to return to a local road. And by that means, we'll be able to run an express public transport services from Tauriko effectively right the way through to the mountain, all the points in between, and vice versa, so that you could actually live in, say, Greerton and have a job in Tauriko Business Estate, have a viable option to live and work in those areas. So in terms of, one of our significant challenges in this RLTP process is to decide on priorities. Certainly for Tauranga City Council, State Highway 29, Hewletts Road, Totara Street are the major infrastructure investments that are central to the future growth of the city. If we could have a targeted transport service along Cameron Road, and we all know we're investing significantly in that corridor now as we speak, there'll be $150 million worth of investment, probably more by the time stage 2 of Cameron Road's finished. That will enable urban intensification along that corridor. And if you take that corridor from Tauriko Business Estate right the way through to the Mount, you've accounted for just about the majority of jobs in the city. And so the opportunity to connect where people live with where they work, where they go to school, where they access health and other services on Cameron Road, which is the core of the service delivery in our city, then you can see the obvious logic of targeting investment. But in order to achieve that, we have to address this funding question, because at the moment we haven't got a hope and heck of funding State Highway 29 soon, and we need to figure out how we're going to do that. Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to lay it on the table because you'll hear me a lot this year talking about those issues.
Point well made. Lee?
Just along those lines, where are you at in terms of looking at the reality of having a public transport service based on Cameron Road under the current design of stage 1? Because we know it slows down buses to what they are now. We know that there are staff and governance at councils and NZTA who have said that it's not a viable outcome. So do you have something that has the analysis to show that that could work?
You talking about Cameron Road stage 1?
I'm talking about the linkage between Tariko, the work that is happening there and the enabling and the longer term stuff that Commissioner Selwood just spoke about. It's all based around public transport has to be a viable option, but we all know at all the workshops and everything that is not being talked about as being viable at a practical level to get mass uptake of public transport.
Probably don't fully understand the question. Mike, did you have anything to add on that one?
Just in terms of the designs on Cameron Road and stage 1 and stage 2, and then the future Tauriko link up. So the idea is that is a strategic corridor for mobility and movement. We're working in the projects to make sure that the PT provision is in those corridors, section by section. And the key part for us is the when. And I think the complicated situation is that all of these things are balanced against each other. So we're working with council on figuring out when we're able to do that and then contribute, because we're an enabler. Some of this work and the land use intensification, which is where we really can do some heavy lifting as a PT service, needs to happen as well. So I guess we're in the same boat as all of us, and we were just making sure that we've got that sort of timing right. And I think there's a lot of dependencies, if buts and maybes, and we've just got to keep working through that. So right now, we're comfortable, heading in the right direction, and we're working with the project on a detailed basis.
David, back to you.
Top point. I actually will throw to Jess just a quick comment on Hewletts Road, Statawai 2.
Yeah, look, so the Connecting Mount Maunganui project, which was previously called Te Hawaii 2 Hewletts Road, is a joint project between TCC, Regional Council, Watahi and Manawhenua. This is an optioneering process working alongside particularly the spatial planning work that's being led with TCC to build on that understanding of what the future of the community is, both the industrial and residential community, and understanding then what the transport needs that come out of that are. We're looking at improvements through not just the state highway network there, but Tortola Street and the surrounding industrial area that will allow better access for freight. We obviously know the port there is crucial to development, but also reduce some of the conflict we have at the moment between freight, private vehicles, walking and cycling and public transport. So trying to work across all modes, ensuring that we've got a really high quality infrastructure service for our bus connections, because I think as was identified earlier, that Hewletts Road and Wanganui connection is really important through to Mount Maunganui and Wanganui Road in Papamoa. It's important to ensure that we've got the ability to provide that ongoing high frequency bus service through there. But it is really about balancing all those modes as well. So ongoing work. We will be looking to come out with the special planning to the community and linking in with that. So we'll be having more conversations with the community going forward. But we're looking to have a preferred option in around May of this year, which will then go through the approval process. Once we have it's been done at what's called an indicative business case level, sort of strategic level, we then move into a detailed business case, which is where we really refine the details of that strategic option further. So progressing well, and very much kind of a partnership project involving a number of people.
And David, these are critically important reports. What I'd like to do is adjourn for morning tea, if you're agreeable, and we'll come back to you two.
Well, yeah.
After.
Mr. Chair, maybe if I just update.
I don't want to speed through the rest of these pages, because I know there's some critically important material here.
I think perhaps if I just finish this slide, then the next slide is the Road to Zero presentation, and Fabian can pick up from there after morning tea. So really the last thing to highlight is the fact that we're progressing with the safety improvements in the Awakere to Whakatane section of State Highway 30. There's been a lot of raru in the community, it would be fair to say, about the proposed safety improvements. And so we will be on the 29th and 30th of this month running a series of community workshops to both inform but also listen to the community's feedback on what we've put forward, bearing in mind that what we've put forward is hey, here's what we could do. Now let's talk about what makes sense in the context of Awakeri to Whakatane, key outcome being safety. We'll come back to this committee once we've had those, and a detailed design starts to form kind of mid 2023. That's probably a good place to stop, Mr. Chair, and then pick up on the Road to Zero conversation after morning tea.
Worship Mayor Denny had a question.
I just want to circle back to TNL Stage 2 and would like to ask whether you can confirm that potential delays on building TNL2, given the funding constraints we're all aware of, and the eventual graded intersection of Omokura intersection, would that hamper housing development at Omokura? As in, would you be forced to submit against housing developments there because there wouldn't be a full graded intersection?
I think I can probably answer that one. We're working with your council at the moment, understand the capacity of the temporary roundabout to make sure that we can maintain safety. So our key focus is ensuring whatever we do is safe, but we're certainly working to support the development and the growth at Omokura.
That's a really good answer. Our key issue there is safety at that intersection. Takitumu Northlink Stage 2, whether it's delayed or not, that roundabout is the critical thing for us in terms of housing development.
Colleen, quick question. You're keeping us from the sausage rolls, so it'll be quick.
At the initial workshop, stakeholder workshop for the what's now the Connecting Maunganui project, it was made very clear that a busway or rapid transit or infrastructure to support public transport was not part of that project. But I think Greg might have been there as well, but certainly that from the freight community and from other stakeholders, it was also very clear that the stakeholders were in a very different space on that project. And I'm increasingly concerned about it, and even the name is concerning because it does indicate this sort of trend happened around Cameron Road as well to look at placemaking, but it takes the focus off getting fast or rapid or whatever word is safe to use, public transport to get from A to B, and to make the emissions cuts that the City Council needs to see to deliver all the plans that we're talking about. There has to be a way to get all the people in Papamoa, potentially to Tumu, all these other areas out east, to and from other parts of Tauranga. So connecting Tauranga, to my mind, would be a better project because it is about not just connecting Mount Maunganui at all. And I'm really concerned that project has changed because taking back a step with UFTI and the transport system plan, the answer we always got when asking where are we going to see the actual change in the public transport system to deliver a viable option for people out east, we were always told that would be in the Hewlett sub-area business case. And now that is no longer the case. And I don't know if you've got anything you can say to explain that.
Yeah, I don't think that it's correct to say that we said, unless I've misunderstood you, that there isn't a focus on high quality, high frequency PT provision through that. That project very much
infrastructure, that was the word.
Yeah, so it definitely is designed to provide for ongoing increases in the service level of service for our buses and to make sure that they are able to increase in capacity and frequency going forward. So it absolutely does that. It is definitely one of the things we all know about, particularly Hewlett's Road, but that broader area, not just Hewlett's Road, is there are a lot of competing interests. And so the freight community, the bus community, so a lot of what we're doing is how can we ensure that we can have high level of service for trucks getting to the port and around. We know that it's not just to the port. We had some great conversations with the freight community about their needs there, but also that we are providing infrastructure for high quality, high frequency bus services. And I think Bay and Plenty Regional Council is very much in the conversation on that. And I'm happy for Mike to contribute anything he wants to that as well.
Yeah, just in addition to that, is we see the options as they're being developed as a series of trade-offs with placemaking and the transport provision. But we are pretty clear with the project team and then with us around what do we need and when do we need to make sure that happens in the capacity that's provided. So we're comfortable at the moment that the options are developing in the right way. It is early stage business case. Some bigger issues that need to be sorted out there first, which don't involve transport. And we really have to wait in the line around what are the outcomes around that, with conversations with our communities and the people that are living there, then the transport option sort of conversation can come in. So right now we're comfortable with that Business Cases Act, participating, and we're concentrating on that as a strategic corridor.
Okay, for those on Zoom, we're going to adjourn now for 15 minutes and return at 11:30, and morning tea is at the back of the room for everyone in the room. So. We're live again. David and Jessica, was that everything before we pass over to Fabian? Is it? Would you like to introduce Fabian? If we can find him. We've lost him. Fabian, you're on stage.
There we go. Welcome to Fabian Marsh from Waka Kotahi. So Fabian Marsh leads our Road to Zero program and has come in today to provide some additional context to Road to Zero, what it's about and why the program exists. So rather than over introducing him, I might hand over to Fabian and let him do his thing. Thank you very much for coming today, Fabian.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm just trying to put the presentation up. And there we go. Excellent. So, good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me here today to talk about Road to Zero. I'm the Senior Manager for Road Safety at Waka Kotahi. My background has been involved in compiling a lot of the work that went into the development of Road to Zero from Waka Kotahi and working very closely with the Ministry of Transport. A lot of the modelling and the context around the key principles of Road to Zero, we've also had a key involvement in that. So I understand you have a paper a little later on around the speed management plan. So I think this will be hopefully some nice context and highlight some of the principles from the Road to Zero perspective in terms of what Road to Zero is trying to achieve, what are the key elements of Road to Zero, and effectively what's being asked from each of the various interventions for each of the regions, those sorts of things. So hopefully, there we go, excellent. So Road to Zero sets us on a path towards a aspirational vision where no one is killed or seriously injured in New Zealand at some nominal point in the future. That represents an ethical imperative where no one deserves to die or be seriously injured on our roads. The strategy is also underpinned by the safe system. And I'll talk a bit more about that because those are the key principles that underpin not only the strategy, but also the speed management plan and the speed management guide, and the speed management plans that are going to come from that. The strategy itself highlights the various focus areas and action plans that we need to focus on out to 2030 if we're to achieve those aspirations. As I mentioned, the vision is a outer New Zealand where no one is killed or seriously injured on our roads. And that's supported by an ambitious but achievable target to reduce deaths and serious injuries by 40% by 2030. As I mentioned, there was a range of interventions that were developed and a lot of modelling that went into underpin that 40% target. At the time the strategy was being developed, the ministry set up around 5 working groups, brought together more than 200 representatives from across New Zealand. They highlighted a range of interventions that would have potential to bring around improvements in road safety performance. And our job was to look at those interventions that are going to offer the greatest benefit, as well as look at those interventions for which we have good evidence, both nationally and internationally, in terms of what works. And putting together that modelling, what we identified is whilst there are numerous activities and actions right across Road to Zero that we need to focus on, there really are 5 key interventions that are going to make a key difference. And the first of those is strengthening our road policing. So we work very closely in partnership with police and Ministry of Transport on the Road Safety Partnership Program. We have targets, for example, for 3 million breast screening tests per annum, 80,000 mobile camera hours per annum. And we're working together to improve the level of road policing to ensure that we're providing that impetus for road users to make good decisions when they're on the network. The second is speed management and speed limits. Vision Zero and Safe System are fundamentally about speed management, and I'll talk a bit more about those in a moment. The Speed Infrastructure Program represents a significant contribution to the 40% target. And the targets associated with that, look, we need to treat at least the 10% or the top 10% or 10,000 kilometres the highest risk road network through speed management. We also have a target of around 1,000 kilometres of medium barrier across the road network. And those corridors that have been identified are based on the collective risk on our roads, or which is the deaths and serious injuries per kilometre. So where we have the highest concentration of the most serious trauma is the roads that we're looking at rolling out the higher order interventions to improve road safety. There'll be further work around safety cameras. We're working, and you'll see more ramping up over this year in particular with regards to the transfer of the safety camera network from the police to Whakatahi. We're currently working on the back office and the infringement processing system. The current police system is at end of life, so we can't just transfer that across, so that will take some time. We're aiming towards the end of this year, early next year, to be in a position to start looking at expanding the camera network. And lastly, safe and clean cars. So David mentioned earlier around the promotion of safer vehicles, and particularly around star ratings. We are also working with the Ministry of Transport. There is some work being done to introduce safety standards for lane keep assist and automatic emergency braking. So once we introduce those standards, those vehicles will then have an impact on the safety performance of the vehicles coming into the fleet from those states that those standards are introduced. So those are the 5 key things that are going to have the biggest impact, as I mentioned, but also that's going to be underpinned and needs to be by a strong regulatory framework and continuing to promote good road user behaviour if we're going to optimise the benefits from each of those interventions. One of the challenges is right now we're not on target to deliver the 40% target. I'll say this a number of times, we know what to do. We've modelled quite comprehensively with the evidence basis on what the scale of implementation is required. We're just not delivering fast enough at the moment. And that has 2 flow-on effects. One is putting at risk whether we achieve the target at the 2030 timeframe, but also the slower the trajectory, the more people are likely to be killed or seriously injured as a consequence throughout between now and then. For the safe system, I just want to spend a little bit of time on this. You'll see some of these principles, I think, flow into your speed management plan. Key here is that we need to acknowledge that people make mistakes. I'll talk about what that means. And the real key aspect of this or principle is around the fact that we need to design for human vulnerability. We as humans only have so much force that we can withstand when a crash occurs. I'd like to talk about that a little bit more. Ultimately, errors are inevitable, crashes will continue to happen, but death and serious injuries as a consequence is not. So we need to promote good choices, but plan for mistakes. And I think it's good to understand what a mistake could look like. We tend to turn our attention to some of the high-risk behaviours, and certainly high-risk behaviours is something we need to continue to focus on. But ultimately, with regards to where our rules are set right now, if everyone followed the road rules overnight, we'd still have 70% of our serious injuries. So it's going to take more than just focusing on extreme behaviours. And a mistake, I'd like to share a personal story, if you don't mind. I was turning right out of an intersection, Watchman Road in Napier Airport. And at that time, the intersection was a right turn lane. It's the end of the expressway there. And I consider myself to be a reasonable driver. Certainly, I have a good appreciation of the risks. And I made an error of judgment on pulling out of that road. And thankfully, I made it across safely, but it was far too close for comfort. And the vehicle that was travelling, like in this image from the side, was not exceeding the speed limit. But at that speed, if a crash did occur, it's very likely I would have been seriously injured. And something as simple as that, or someone, a parent, turning around to check on the children or a dog or a pet on the back seat could mean all of a sudden they're across the centre line, which leads to a head-on crash. So those things, we are human, we make those mistakes. We need to look at how we design the system to accommodate those things. We also know that when a crash does occur, there are the vast majority of deaths and serious injuries really boil down to 4 key crash types, and that's head-on crashes, run-off road crashes where a vehicle might roll over or run into an object, intersection crashes, particularly side impact, right turning crashes, and crashes involving vulnerable road users like pedestrians and cyclists. And with that in mind, there is a significant amount of evidence available around what is the level of energy or speed that people can withstand for each of those crashes. I'll just play this video while I'm talking and see if it works. Here we go. So one of those key crash types is a head-on crash. And you can see here what this video is trying to show is that as you incrementally increase speed, not only does the damage increase, but so does the likelihood you're going to sustain more significant injuries. What many people probably wouldn't appreciate is that you have about a 10% chance of a fatality in a head-on crash where the two vehicles are travelling at 70 kilometres an hour. And that chance or risk increases exponentially above 70 kilometres an hour. And we know we have speed limits on our rural road network at 100 kilometres an hour with no physical protection. And that's a real challenge and a real safety concern. So this is just showing now the side impacts. So the similar principles apply to side impacts. The threshold, we shouldn't be, people should be protected from side impacts at speeds above 50 kilometres an hour. And similarly for pedestrians, pedestrians shouldn't be exposed to impacts with cars above 30 kilometres an hour. That's fundamentally the key principle of safe system and what we're trying to do. So the challenge then becomes, how do you design a system in a way that protects people from exposure to these limits? And vehicle technology will improve over time, but right now we only really have two courses when it comes to things like head-on crashes, and that's to physically separate so that the crash doesn't occur at all, or to manage speed. And that's the underlying principle behind why we put a medium barrier, and in which case we might be able to keep the speed limit higher. Without that physical separation, we really need to manage to those physical limits of speed and injury that we just looked at. So that means we really need to look at rolling out more safe and appropriate speed limits. I'll talk a little bit more about the infrastructure, but the reality is we won't be able to put in heavy infrastructure across the vast majority of New Zealand roads. It's a huge network and costly to install a lot of that infrastructure. So we will need to be relying on a combination of safe and appropriate speed limits, safety cameras, those sorts of things. And a safe and appropriate speed limit is a speed limit that's based on those safe system limits that we just looked at, as well as aligned to community wellbeing objectives and movement in place function, the design infrastructure of a street on the road. And this is a self-fulfilling circle in that if we reduce speed limits, we see fewer people killed and seriously injured. We reduce emissions and air pollution. That then creates a healthier and safer environment for everyone, so we can get more people out walking and cycling, safer access to public transport. That then reduces vehicle travel, and you have that sort of virtuous cycle continuing. Another key opportunity is that a small change in travel speed leads to a relatively large change in stopping distance, a much larger change in impact speed, a still larger change in impact energy, and a very large change in the probability of death or serious injury. And to give some context of that, there's been some quite comprehensive research that shows if you can reduce the average speed on the network by 10%, you'll reduce the risk of fatalities by about 40% and the risk of serious injuries by about 30%. And we've seen that repeatedly demonstrated through international research. We're also seeing a growing body of evidence here in New Zealand that shows that actually we're finding very similar outcomes. We've had some evaluations on a number of rural roads where we've actually found that we have achieved even better death and serious injury reductions than that. I'll just give you a very quick example. So State Highway 6 Blenheim to Nelson, obviously quite a significant stretch of highway, 110 kilometres an hour. At the time was obviously of significant interest with regards to potentially reducing the speed limits there. Significant proportions of that road have been lowered to 90 kilometres an hour and others to 80 and even lower. What we've seen as a consequence of that, it's pretty early to tell, it's only been 2 years, but we've reduced death and serious injuries by 80%. As I said, we'd expect that to probably be more like 30%, so maybe over time that will play out a bit differently. But one of the things that's always raised is the impact on travel time. And what we found is over that 110 kilometres, there's been an increase of 4 minutes on average, which is on average 2 seconds per kilometre. So we're trading off 2 seconds per kilometre versus, at the moment, an 80% reduction in death and serious injury. So we all have a role to play. That's another key part of the safe system. Wokutaki is looking to set national policy, as I mentioned, around things like our vehicle standards and so forth, as well as the new speed management guide that we've developed. Council staff and elected members, you have a role in terms of how you set your speed limits. And as I mentioned, you'll have a paper that will be of very great interest coming up later on around your speed management plan. Police are out there enforcing our speed limits. And we still need to work on providing the right information to our road users as well and encouraging them. But ultimately, we do have responsibility in how we design the system. That intersection I talked about before at Watchman Road, that quickly became at the time New Zealand's #1 high-risk road, high-risk intersection. And that was as a consequence of that right turn risk. Since then, the intersection has been changed to a roundabout, and the problem's essentially gone away. And that shows the effect and the huge significance of how we design the road network and what tools actually work can do to bring about reductions in trauma. I won't go into detail about median barriers. I know you have some projects in your patch. All I'll say here is that where we've installed median barriers and roadside barriers in combination, we've seen reductions in deaths at as much as 90%. On average, where we put in median barriers, we see a reduction in death and serious injury of about 65%. It is our highest order intervention to reduce road trauma on our rural roads because it provides that physical separation. Speed management is not as effective as physical separation, and that's what median barriers do. Another intervention, roundabouts will obviously be key. Roundabouts are seen as a key safety system intervention. Another one that's emerging is raised safety platforms. Now, these aren't the same as the speed humps you see outside schools. These are specifically designed for those impact speeds we mentioned earlier. So if you've got a lot of pedestrians, the platforms should be designed so that you're generally travelling over the 30 kilometres an hour. If it's for side impacts, generally at 50 kilometres an hour. So this was an intersection that was installed in Thomas Gordonton in Hamilton. And what you can see there down the bottom is the significant impact it's had on the level of trauma pre and post. On average, again, we'd expect to see death and serious injury reduced by about 40%. A really well-designed roundabout could be expected to reduce death and serious injury by about 85–90%. If you put in a traffic signals, it might reduce by about 50%. And that's why roundabouts are actually more effective than traffic signals. You can get traffic signals closer to roundabouts in terms of road safety performance by adding safety platforms like these.
And just pause for one moment, Stacey.
Thank you. I've probably got a couple of, observations that maybe make a bit of a comment on. So we've had a lot of presentations as an organisation over the year about road zero strategies around the world, and sometimes they've been really successful. A few years ago, we had a presentation from Western Australia with the elephant in the wheat field, which was obviously a huge community-led initiative. The FIA, being our global governing body, has done a lot of international research into the effectiveness of a Road to Zero campaign, and I guess it's sort of echoed in a lot of the media that's coming out at the moment. The times that they are most effective appears to be where they are community-driven and community-led rather than a government initiative that filters down. What's happening to sort of change the narrative from we're wasting money on ads that don't work to we're doing things? And I guess a further example of that would be something like the media that's come out in the last couple of days showing that we're well behind, more than half of the median barriers targets that were planned have not been implemented, but we're well ahead of speed limit dropping targets.
Yeah, great questions there. With regards to the media has obviously highlighted the fact that we'll ask the question, is Road to Zero working? We had the same question around safer journeys. The evidence is absolutely clear. We know what to do. We know what works. We have modelled out quite comprehensively what it's going to take. The challenge is we're not delivering it fast enough. Where we have rolled out Road to Zero principles and projects, we're seeing good progress, as I just mentioned before, around State Highway 6 Bellington Nelson. All of these race safety platforms in Hamilton have been very effective. There's a number of other examples around there. The challenge is we haven't rolled them out enough. And I think that comes back to the point you make there about bringing communities with us. Ultimately, the success here is going to be bringing communities with us. If we had community demand for speed limits, median barriers, safety platforms, more policing, it would make life a lot easier and we could do it a lot faster. And so that is something that we have recognised. With regards to the campaign work that you will have seen, for better or worse, we are trying to change the conversation around road safety, because traditionally the education or the information that's been coming out about road safety is about trying to elicit better behaviour, reminding people not to drink drive, make sure you wear your seatbelts, and that's all important. But most people do know that they shouldn't speed, that they should wear a seatbelt. And so we're fast approaching, if we haven't reached already, a point of diminishing returns by continuing to hammer home those sorts of messages. We need to maintain that but we can't expect that that's going to be the solution to our problems. So what we're looking at is then, if we know that these types of interventions are going to make the difference between where we are now and getting us to our aspiration, we can then look at how do we bring communities with us. And that's the intent of trying to change the conversation around the toll ad that you would have seen and some the ads around the speed limits and so forth. Yes, they might not have been hit the mark quite right. What they have done successfully is got the conversation going. I even saw last night on the project, the conversations around school travelling for children and cycling buses and things like that. And it's good to see that conversation starting. I think we've got a lot more work to do in that space. All I can say is, me personally, I'd like to be going faster as well, and that's a challenge for us. Part of it's going to be bringing communities with us.
Maybe and just pause for a moment. Is worship there, Luca?
Yeah, I've got some figures here with at least 22 factors that determine both fatalities and injuries, and you've fixed on speed. You seem to concentrate on speed limits because I guess it's the low-hanging fruit. But you've got things like inattention, which is a major factor in determining both injuries and fatalities, as well as alcohol use and a whole bunch. I mean, it's a hierarchy. Well, what are you doing in all those areas? I mean, it's easy to put a lollipop sign with this number on it, and you do your modelling, which is relatively simplistic. It's not easy to model human behaviour. You put a speed limit of 80 in front of me, and being impatient, my reaction would be to try and overtake everybody who's going slow, at great risk to my wallet and my life, probably.
Again, some great comments there. I think we've shifted the focus towards the consequence of those decisions, because when it comes to head-on crashes, there could be a consequence of people being impaired, people making an error of judgment, all of those sorts of things. And what I would highlight, though, is that if you go back to those sort of high philosophical treatments, is separation or speed management. If we can put more median barrier in, great. What we're actually seeing is on Centennial Highway, there will be people that are impaired. There will be people that are inattentive, and then that barrier gets hit once or twice every month. But people are driving away and people aren't being killed. If we can do more of that, great. We would like to, and we like to do as much of median barrier as we can. But where we can't, which is going to be unfortunately most of New Zealand, we have a tool that does work, which is speed limits. And no one's suggesting for a moment that it's perfect. We actually do have quite good evidence of what works. So if we put a median barrier in, we'll reduce death and serious injuries by about 65%. Comparatively, if we just lower the speed limit and do nothing else, it'll be more like 20 to 30%. But 20 to 30% applied across a large part of the network will make up for significant change and improvement in death and serious injury. So the last point to make there, I think, is we're not pointing to any single intervention here. There is no single silver bullet that's going to solve the problem. But we do have a lot of tools that work. We have the evidence on how they work. We need to apply them if we want to see their benefits.
What can we do with inattention? I mean, I guess these things, as well, which...
Yeah, so we do.
How do you deal with that?
We do. I mean, inattention, particularly with mobile phones is more of an urban issue. And therefore, because speeds are lower, we don't see as many deaths and serious injuries as a result of mobile phone use. So it's important for the police, and police do have distraction and mobile phone detection as one of their indicators. But it would be secondary to speed and people wearing their seatbelts and people not driving impaired. In terms of the evidence that's available to us. But we do have some work. I mean, the police have targets in terms of distracted driving. We have rolled out a technology-based automated system in Auckland to trial, as they've done in other jurisdictions in Australasia, to look at automatically detecting people through artificial intelligence, whether they're carrying a phone or not, and that issues them some fines and so forth. So those things are emerging. I think the thing we need to acknowledge is they are human behaviours. They are things that do continue. How do you best tackle that? And I don't think it's going to be possible for the police to police all of that. So we need to find other solutions. And the solutions over time, which we might not have yet, are probably more likely to be technology-based, whether you can actually prevent phones from being used in vehicles and things like that. So those are all the things that we will be looking at going forward as well.
Maybe we do need to move on.
Yes, I'm pretty much done actually. Just wanted to highlight the reason we go to some interventions is because not all interventions are the same. You can see in this table that's been there for a while now, we actually try to roll out as many safe system or primary safe system treatments as possible because they do save lives more. And the last slide is really, as I mentioned, just to reiterate, we know what works, we know how much stuff we have to do. Our challenge is we're not delivering at the necessary pace and scale at the moment. And how do we do that? Thank you for your time.
think we've had enough questions through the presentation if the committee is of my same opinion. So I will move that we receive the Waka Kotahi update and the presentation, seconded by Commissioner Selwood. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. Now, Inspector Nightingale did ask to be slotted in at this point to make some relative comments on behalf of the New Zealand Police. So welcome, Inspector Nightingale.
Thank you, kia ora koutou. Thank you to Fabian. And thank you to Fabian for that presentation. Great to meet you. So just by way of a very short background, and I need to put a little bit of a personal lens over the work that I'm leading in the Bay of Plenty as well. With 35 years in policing and quite a chunk of that in dedicated road policing. When I first heard about Road to Zero, naturally my curiosity was piqued. And when I first saw the presentation about 18 months ago, I must admit, I felt excited. And I thought this was the first time I've seen an organisation show such passion and interest in making our roads safe. And that's about making sure that our families, our friends and our loved ones are getting from A to B safely without dying, often because of simple oversight. So my personal view from a strong road policing background from the Ministry of Transport, back when things were a lot more black and white, excuse the pun, with the vehicles and the uniforms, but and having gone right through every aspect of policing to becoming an area commander, which I'm doing right now, I think that the Road to Zero and working in partnership with WK is the way forward for New Zealand for our roads. So that's pretty exciting stuff. I was asked to come into by the district commander to take over the road policing role for a period of 4 months to really fix a whole bunch of issues that were happening in the Bay of Plenty. Let's say things that weren't happening that should have been happening. Some of my colleagues have thought that maybe I was brought in as a hatchet man. Not necessarily the case, but certainly have applied a hatchet to our mindset and the way that we think. And so I came into the road policing space for the district commander and said that I can fix this. It's not really something I chose to do. I was enjoying my other role, but it's something he needed a hand with. So being absolutely frank, we have 12 policing districts in the Bay of Plenty, in New Zealand, and Bay of Plenty was the worst performing district. It's as simple as that. So from a taxpayer's perspective, you could ask yourself, what on earth were our people doing when they're out in police cars, when they're meant to be doing traffic work and focusing on getting our people from A to B safely? So my mission is to absolutely bring up our productivity and to improve that. So I focus on 4 areas for this 4-month period, and I've set up some structures and systems in place that will be followed when I go back to my other role. And the first one is around our deployment. That's about what we do when we're actually out on the road. When we're doing dedicated traffic work, is are we in the right places, doing the right activity at the right time, and doing the right volume of that. And I think from a layman's perspective, anyone here would expect that that would be bread and butter, simple stuff. Hasn't necessarily been the case, and that our people haven't been well directed. As well as that, they have often been distracted to do other general policing activity, going to family harm jobs and other jobs, when in fact we have police safety teams where that's their core role. So I want our road policing teams focusing on road safety and road policing. Another aspect that I focused on is our tactics, which is what we actually do when we're doing our road work and how we detect offences. And it was mentioned about distractions. So last Friday, as an example, this is happening across the district now. I joined the Tauranga crew. We went to a great little spot where there are people going to work. And in an hour, we pulled in about 40 people that were on their cell phones, driving along on their cell phones, or they had no seatbelts on. And these are just people going to work like us. So every interaction resulted in an infringement notice and everybody getting breath tested. And even at 9 o'clock in the morning, you can get someone who's 3 or 4 times over the limit, haven't been on it the night before. So we do a lot in that distraction space. There are no warnings for cell phones. There are no warnings for seatbelt offences. And with our tactics as well, we looked at our speed bracket. So when we started talking about issuing notices at lower speed, this might be a bit scary for some in the room, but we are absolutely targeting underneath 11 kilometres over the limit. And at the end of the day, It's not the crime of the century, it's a $30 fine. But it provides an excellent opportunity for a conversation with the motorists where we're saying, look, we need to be reducing our average speeds on the road. And if our radar is saying that someone's doing 109 and it's a consistent speed, their speedo is probably reading higher than that. And out of, when we started having these conversations with our staff, some said, I'm never going to do this. And the thing is that if that's their mindset, they need to find another job because it won't be in road police. And this is the language that we've been using. So what we've seen is our target and these targets are publicly known. And the conflict, I guess, and the problem with the police not doing what we meant to have been doing has been in the news. There's no secrets here either. So for the Bay of Plenty, when I came in, about 4.5% of our infringements for speed under 11 Ks, we're under 11 Ks, so we weren't doing many. And it needs to be at 15% is what we've agreed to do. So 15% of all our speeding notices should be at under 11 kilometres an hour. So we're at 14% at the moment, so there's a big jump up. And the staff come back to me and they say, man, this is really different because I don't have to chase them for miles down the highway because they're not going that fast. I flash my headlights, put on the lights, and they often just pull over right beside me. We have a really good conversation. I don't get any abuse from anybody, and you get an opportunity to explain the why. And as Kiwis, we generally don't like being told what to do. And how to drive and how to do certain things. But we find as a constabulary, if we take that time to explain the why to our people, there aren't any issues. I haven't heard of any conflict or complaints or any issues around that so far. So the mindset is a big deal. It's my third area, and that's not just with our road policing staff, that's with our senior managers, and I'm talking the district commander, my colleagues, my inspectors, colleagues, right through all the general policing teams, our dog handlers, youth and community, everybody. And so what we're saying is that if you see something happening that's a bit dodgy on the road, someone's on their phone, they're going too fast, is you pull them over and you deal with it. See something, do something. And that's what we're expecting across the whole team. And also changing the mindset of the public. And that's going to be coming through media and through our conversations and through our social media that we're doing as well. And then the last area of focus for me is one of our most important, and that's our partnership space, is that we need to be proactive in partnering with our partners like Waka Kotahi, with council, with other organisations that use the roadwork, the roading network, so that we're on the same page and we achieve a lot more together than just on our own. So to help us achieve these things, we have set, I put forward productivity measures for our staff that I expect that they do. And you know, none of this is hard. I'm an inspector. That seemed a bit wrong that as the area commander, I was dealing with more road offences than someone who is a full-time traffic member who has 8 to 9 hours at their disposal. And so we've had a lot of hard conversations, and it's about not actually going out to be distracted with other types of work. Sure, we go and back up our staff. Sure, we go to emergencies. That's still going to happen. But as soon as the police safety team are available to deal with it, we cut a track and we're back out on the highways. And that's predominantly where we should be. So we support this journey with Waka Kotahi and Road to Zero. We've made some big inroads in the Bay of Plenty with our infringements. And so if you don't wear a seatbelt, if you're on your phone, if you're speeding, if you're even doing 109, 108, good chance you get pulled over and get an infringement notice. That's my expectations. It's the expectation of the district commander, and it does create that great conversation. Apart from the Waka Kotahi measures, the police are naturally focused on our impaired drivers and so forth. Tauranga, unfortunately, Bay of Plenty has a reputation as being the worst place for drink driving in New Zealand, as in the most amount of drink drivers, and I've seen evidence of that. So I managed to persuade the district commander to look at doubling the team that we have here in Western Bay of Plenty, and they used to go down Eastern Bay of Plenty and up the Coast Road, and they used to go into other areas and to do joint operations with other teams as well. And so we're going to be looking at creating a second team and have that running as long as we can. As well as the normal police focus of our restraints, impaired drivers, our distracted drivers, people on cell phones and speed, we don't ignore all the other things too. So we deal with the vehicle faults, we deal with the boy racers and the high risk drivers. But we do have a lot available to us now, instead of, with unlicensed drivers as an example, we have a process where we can refer them to agencies that will pick them up and actually help them get their driver license if they simply can't afford to do it. And there's a lot of people in that situation. So we're trying to get people off that treadmill of offending, and traffic offending is a great way to end up in prison. So we try to get people off that treadmill and on a better path, and there's a lot that we do that and do in that space. So I expect our people to be chipping out our bikies, and I ride motorcycles, but I don't go running people over in Bethlehem like we saw recently. So the criminal element that drive on our roads in the Bay of Plenty are on notice, and I expect our team to be absolutely hammering them. They will drive with no number plates on, they will drive at high speed, and you'll see them passing everyone like they own the roads, and that has to stop. So all our new constables coming out of the college get a briefing from me as well. They get to meet me, and I tell them around the things that are really important, and we send that message to those criminal groups. I really love the technology that is in the pipeline around cell phone usage, seatbelt usage, possibly point-to-point cameras and speed cameras. I'm a big fan of mobile cameras. We use those as a really good tool. The future's not so clear, but everything else I think is going to be fantastic, and that means that to an extent we will be able, the police officers will be able to focus more on those state highways, the places where people are getting killed. And so when I read this and had a good look at what you've got in the pipeline, Fabian, I felt more excited than I did before. So good things in place for the Bay of Plenty, good things coming for the Bay of Plenty, good things in place. Anecdotal feedback from staff is, and I can see the numbers, they're pumping out the work to where they should be. They're up the Kaimais, they're on State 2 North, State 2 South. I commute each day at the moment to State 36, and I was shocked at the increase of speeds on that back road. For some people, it's a personal racetrack, so I hammer that on my way to work. And you'll get plenty, and people just need to know to slow down. So we make no apologies for what we're doing. My only apology is that we should have been doing this years sooner. And so we're in catch-up mode. We will smash our targets, and we will see fatal crashes and serious injury crashes reduced in the Bay of Plenty, and that's good news for all of us.
Well done, Inspector, and I repeat again, it's good to have the New Zealand Police back at the table. So brilliant contribution today. So we need to speed things up a little bit, folks. So can I ask you to move to item 8.3 on page 45, and Michael, can you do the introduction, please?
Kia ora, everyone. We will move at pace with the speed management plan for the region. Just wanted to highlight the connection between Fabian's presentation and these pieces of work. To set up that virtuous cycle, is all parts of the system need to work in tandem and together, and this is one part of it, and part of our role as a region and as TLAs in the speed management space. Just introducing Ollie and Katrin.
Welcome.
Chair, kia ora koutou, ko Katri taku ingoa, so I'm Katri, I'm a transport planner here at Toi Moana. Thank you, Fabian, for a great introduction to speed management. So I'm here to kind of continue that conversation by introducing a paper on the development of a regional speed management plan for the Bay of Plenty. To keep it super brief, this report presents a great vision, objectives, principles, and missions for the Bay of Plenty regional speed management plan. These have been collectively workshopped with all the Bay of Plenty road controlling authorities and have been endorsed by the regional advisory group. These now collectively seek the RTC's endorsement, and this has been outlined in recommendation 2 on page 45 of the report. So that's a very quick overview. Other than that, I'm happy to take the report as read and to answer any questions.
Well done. Okay, any questions or points of clarification to Katri? Would someone like to move the recommendations on page 45? Mia Luca, are you happy to do that? Wonderful. And And His Worship David Moore, all those in favour, please say aye. Against, carry. Thank you. Andrew.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maintaining the speed brief, I will try to skip through this one as well quickly. So I'll take the paper endorsing the high-level strategic approach to RLTP development as read, just noting the key points there in the executive summary, which essentially confirms the approach to developing the framework of the RLTP based on the briefing document which was presented to you as part of the briefing on the 3rd of February. It outlines the draft ILM process which we've been through recently, and just notes some of the key mitigations and risks, including the release of the GPS. Thank you.
Okay. Questions to Andrew? Commissioner Selwyn.
Thank you, Chair. I'm happy with the recommendation to receive the work that was done in the workshop, but the recommendation to note the development of the ILM gives me some concern. To me, the ILM doesn't really explain the problems and the solutions that we have. And I wonder whether, Chair, we need to do a workshop with this group or ask the staff to go away and have another look. To me, I mean, if I were to sum it up, and various members of the committee will have different views, but I've identified 5 problems. Congestion in our urban centres is negatively affecting our quality of life and our economic productivity. And congestion is not even recognised really as a problem. If you go and have a look at the vital data in the Victor Revius report later, the community is telling you loud and clear that congestion is very much top of their minds. Secondly, our carbon emissions are too high, and we need to do something about that. Our roads, footpaths, cycleways aren't safe, and nor is the behaviour on them. So we need to do something about that. Our 4th problem is clearly the resilience of our network, which is Cycling Gabrielle is clearly highlighted for us. And our 5th, and I would argue probably our biggest problem right now, is that we don't have sufficient funding to invest at the level required to address the previous 4 problems that I outlined. And unless, I mean, I'm a little bit worried by these ILM processes because they take you down a pathway. If you don't get your problem definitions right to start with, then your investment doesn't fit that. So, yeah, I really just wanted to raise my concern about that. I wonder whether other committee members share my view of whether or not we need to do some more work on this.
I've just spoken to Mike, and with regards to the workshop, we're returning it to staff. And Michael, I'll hand over to you, but our gut feeling at the moment is to address your request for a workshop sooner rather than later. So, Michael.
For you, Mr. Chair. Yep, very happy to help and sort of expand that. I would just make the point that these ILMs are fundamental to the process and the conversation around pulling apart the problems in such a way that they do represent what the committee feels are the issues in the region is really important. There has been sort of fairly extensive conversation already, and what I would like not to do is to upset the apple cart too far, but notwithstanding there are some issues that were laid out today. I think one of the big elephants in the room around affordability of infrastructure, particularly transport infrastructure, is something that we will have to make part of this process, and perhaps it's through the ILM, or perhaps it's in the way that we can recognise as an issue when we develop the program. So I think a conversation around what we're looking to achieve is absolutely necessary, but the ILM may not be the best way to do it. So maybe we could take that offline and discuss about the right time to put those concerns into the process. There are opportunities to make sure that they affect the way that we do things.
So, Commissioner, would you be happy with a 4th one being added there, that a workshop takes place to address the investment logic map and associated issues? Or
that would be fine, Chief.
Happy with that? Okay. Before I put the recommendations, is there any further discussion? Yeah, Luca.
I'd just like to endorse what you said. It's all about funding. Without funding, we're not going to be doing anything, and we're just talking, shooting the breeze, basically. And also, yeah, problem definition, absolutely critical. You don't get that right, you don't get the rest of it right.
That's right. Any other questions or comments? Okay, I will put those recommendations, one with the addition of number 4, that a workshop takes place to address the investment logic and associated issues sooner rather than later, but that won't be part of the recommendation, but you've heard the call for it. You happy with that, Commissioner? No. Good, I'll put it, all those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. Okay, endorsement of the final Western Bay of Plenty Travel Demand Management Scoping Study. Now, this is a frightening document in terms of size. And I know you would have looked in horror and thought you were going to have to bring sleeping bags to this meeting, but it's actually going to be tabled for information, as I understand it. Correct. Okay, so Michael, are you leading off on this?
I've just introduced Matt, who's been working on this project, and really well.
That it's for information.
That's correct. Thank you for that, Mr. Chair. I'd like to take the paper as read, but I do have a very small presentation just to give an overview on TDM and a bit more context to the paper. Cool. So furthering on from Darren's presentation earlier on and on travel demand management, TDM really aims to change travel behaviours through targeted interventions. It looks really at soft things rather than providing infrastructure like our other projects. Some things that we do in travel demand management include developing travel plans for schools, businesses, community groups, and promotions and incentives to encourage people really to ditch the car for walking, cycling and public transport. Strategy, so travel demand management is identified in our regional land transport plan as a strategic intervention, but it's also a key part in achieving our urban form and transport initiative, land use settlement, the connected centres, and achieving investment in our Western Bay Transport System Plan. Specifically for the scoping study for the Western Bay that's been completed, it sets out the current TDM initiatives for the Western Bay and an indicative 1 to 3 year program and way forward for TDM. I note that it's already been endorsed by the Western Bay Transport System Plan Governance Group on the 10th of October last year. There have also been 2 other reports that have been completed for travel demand management. These scoping studies were for the Eastern Bay and Rotorua, and these were both previously endorsed at the last Regional Transport Committee meeting on the 19th of September 2022. So today, seeking endorsement from the RTC for the Western Bay scoping study, which will mean that we have endorsement across the 3 scoping studies in total and will allow Regional Council to further advance our TDM planning. Happy to take any questions on that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Worship Mayor Denyer, then Glenn.
Yeah, I noticed on page 71, I don't actually agree with reducing the appeal of driving. We need a more carrot than stick approach. Where many of my residents live rurally, and there's not another feasible option, and unlikely to be one anytime soon. So things that actually dissuade you from driving is not something that I favour. Provide buses, provide mode shift as much as you can, but let's not just penalise drivers who have no choice.
I'm happy to comment there. In terms of the TDM, it's very targeted. It has to be, and it's around the customer group that you target. So the messaging and the action is around understanding what their needs are before you go ahead and do things. So for the whole, all the examples within here would be a targeted approach, and what's relevant to this region.
Thank you.
Glenn?
I had 3 points. One is the linkage to infrastructure, and I don't know if you have any comment, but it just seems to be what's in the plan does not tie in with what's in the infrastructure plans. And an example of that is the Otumotai Peninsula, I think has 6,700 outgoing movements a day. So it's the biggest in Tauranga. it's got the Accessible Streets program that TCC is delivering in the next few years as a like 1% of the investment going into it. So you could pick a whole lot of areas, but that's probably the most outstanding one for me when I look at it. And it doesn't seem to sort of recognise that in Santa Monica and the examples given, you know, the only reason it worked in Santa Monica is because of the infrastructure investment in alignment with that TDM. And I see a huge disconnect in here. And it's reiterated on page 91. Excuse me, the scoping study has identified a likely potential problem with TSP projects and business cases pointing past each other. The risk is that TDM components of the TSP, even if they are scoped, won't be delivered. And I think that's highlighting, you know, you can look at it from any angle, but they do not talk to each other. And then it just means you've got 11.5 million, which I think will be frittered away in small scale outcomes, unless they're tied into a revamp of how this works together with the TSP. And I guess the other point is just the, in terms of the plan itself, I think that there are a number of things there where I don't see a commitment from the public, from the council governance, from council management to actually put some oomph behind what people are wanting. And part of that, you know, part of it might be what Mayor Denny is talking about, is this, the way it's framed up can be sort of anti-car, but I think part of that is the cost equation that's been talked about, but there's something else going on here as well, where I get the sense that when you get down to the nitty-gritty, it's not connecting up in any way there.
Let's just redefine for us what a scoping study actually is. People are sort of starting to feel everything's being signed off here today, but just elaborate on exactly what a scoping study is.
Literally just a high-level scoping study, a high-level document review of what travel demand management is for the Western Bay. The report itself just highlights what TDM is, highlights what initiatives are and what other places, some successful places are currently doing for TDM. And it highlights what we've currently done in the past for travel demand management and what we could do at a high level going forward.
So we're receiving the report today, the endorsement of the final Western Bay of Plenty Travel Demand Management Scoping Study, and we endorse the final Western Bay of Plenty Travel Demand Management Scoping Study. So, further questions or comments, anybody? Oh, Commissioner.
Chair, it's really on that kind of future conversation about what we do that I really wanted to focus. I'm quite happy to receive the report, but I do think that we need to be, as Mike says, much more targeted and our approaching quite action focused. So we've got a joint public transport committee meeting with the regional council. We've discussed, by way of example, let's get some low-cost park and ride facilities in on our core transport corridors within 6 months, certainly before the end of the year, where we can start testing out the viability of that. Glenn's point about the Otamotai corridor, the faster we can get that accessible cycling route connecting through to the city, the better. My concern with the report as it is, it's kind of so all-encompassing that you end up not being able to see the wood for the trees. And I think we have a relatively small amount of money here to spend. If we don't focus and target that in the best possible way and actually do something tangible on the ground sooner rather than later, we'll be here in another 12 months kind of redoing another scoping study and no further ahead. So it's really the call to action, and let's get on. I mean, I'd love to see, we hear Mark Lasson's presentations on a frequent basis about his creative solutions. And actually, I think he's got some fantastic ideas, and I'd love to implement some of them sooner in terms of a funky service along Cameron Road or wherever, with some decent bus stops linked to a park and ride. We could actually start to make a difference.
You're having a few wins today, Commissioner. I've just had some table talk with Michael here. So if we were to kill endorsing the final Western Bay of Plenty Travel Demand Management Scoping Study and just leave it at receiving the report, Michael, can you comment on any fallout that could occur with
No, again, because it's a scoping study, it's a long list of potential options, but what I'm hearing here is action's the byword, and a program of response is what's required in terms of what we're going to do in a prioritised order.
So if that's, there, Luke.
No, I'll move it.
You have, well, let's delete part 2. So we're killing off part 2. So you're moving the recommendation that we receive the report endorsement of the final Western Bay of Plenty Travel Demand Management Scoping Study. Commissioner, are you happy to second that? Okay, I'll put it to the meeting. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carry. Well done, guys. We're having a few wins today, Commissioner. We're going to get another one here too, because I'm going backwards in the agenda. Back on that resolution around the investment logic map, I've said to the committee clerk that we add the word with urgency. And Michael here has asked me to also include there that we work closely with TCC and the Western Bay of Plenty Regional Council to address the issues. I'll give it to you later. Okay, moving on. And Alistair, you're on stage. Welcome back. Sorry, Glenn, did you have a question before? Did you, I see your hand up? Okay, welcome, Alistair. Good to have you here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, all. My name is Alistair Talbot. I'm with Tauranga City Council, and with me is Craig Richards, who's assisted us in developing this transport emissions projection tool. So the purpose is just to step the committee through, I guess, the rationale why we've developed an emissions projection tool and how or what it includes, and how we're currently using it. So the purpose of the tool, purpose of the tool was essentially to aid the council to understand how projected emissions might fit within the developing government targets, and then allow us to run some scenarios based on the available levers to see how we could respond and where that response might best sit or be led from. I won't go into the national level targets too much. I think they've been discussed very well and in depth already at this committee. I guess just to note that that first target essentially means a freezing of vehicle kilometres travelled in the Tauranga Western Bay sub-region in the context of somewhere between 10 and 20% growth in jobs and population over the next decade. The tool itself, in terms of what it provides insight on, so it includes private car travel, light commercial travel, public transport, active modes, and it does also include freight. So it allows us to essentially understand current demand associated with those different modes of movement, and then I guess toggle that demand depending on the lever that we're looking to apply. The tool itself is based off the agreed transport system plan program. So this was that partnership agreed program across the Smart Growth Partners, KiwiRail, Priority One, and Port of Tauranga. And essentially, in terms of the hierarchy, it aligns with the Ministry of Transport's and Wakate's guidance to apply that travel avoidance, mode shift or shift travel type, and then the sort of better travel option of vehicle technology. That then gives us understandings of what VKT impact or emissions impact over time results from applying the different avoid, shift, or improve travel lever. In terms of outputs, the tool gives us, I guess, two key insights. One relates to the impact of a particular lever on vehicle kilometres travelled, and that's the type of graph we see on the left, and that's able to be done over time based on the transport model, the sub-regional transport model. And then on the right, it gives us a corresponding output in terms of emissions reduction. We're able to see that impact relative to the MOT target, but also the local VKT target from our transport model. And I think it's just worth noting that there are two targets there, which is unfortunate, but that's just simply reflective of, and this is the dashed and the solid red line on the graph on the left, reflective of the different methodologies to calculating VKT. MOT uses a national travel database. We use, I guess, our more granular sub-regional transport model. If I just refer you to the council report, which is sort of page 216 of your agenda, that sets out a particular scenario which we've been able to apply and run using the tool. And that looks at that avoidance, shift and improved travel levers. And then the graphs on those following pages sets out the impacts of each lever. But page 220 identifies the key observations from us running the tool. And that is essentially that the travel avoidance approach, which is, I guess, based on perhaps increased working from home, meaning people aren't travelling as much, has very limited impact on vehicle kilometres travelled and emissions reduction. What we've found also through running the tool is that there is very considerable mode shift required. And the example given in that scenario is an uptake or an increase from base in 2018 of 1.3% public transport kilometres travelled to 15% by 2035 to achieve that reduction in VKT. And then ultimately to achieve the emissions reduction, the real lever and of impact is around improved technology. So that's the shift to electric vehicles and, I guess, shift to more efficient fuels that run vehicles. Some of those levers you'll see in the observations in the report sit with local government. Others certainly sit more on that sort of national policy regulation level. All require considerable funding. I think just the last slide. It's not going to let me get to the last slide. Oh, yes. So, yeah, the last slide was just, I guess, maybe of particular interest to the committee to show just that scale of change from private car travel to other modes, particularly public transport, that would be required over time to achieve the targets. So we're continuing to use this tool. It is informing discussions across the Western Bay sub-region, particularly to develop the TSP refresh. And I guess it's helping us to understand just the scale of the issue we have as a sub-region.
And the report is now open for discussion and any questions to Alistair and Craig. Glenn, and then his worship. The ears are lining up here. Okay, Glenn first, go for it.
You can probably ask the questions as well as answer them, I think, Alistair, because I've had the conversation offline with you to some extent. But I guess that the message that is coming out from Tauranga City Council is there's not much we can do. This is, all these changes can't really achieve much. But I think that sort of understates what you've shown can happen. So, and under scenario C or whatever, there's still a 38% reduction with the existing land use patterns that are being proposed, which is close to the minus 41% national target for emissions, that is. And it comes back to me and Luca's point around growth. If you had static growth, you'd have a very different conversation, obviously. but I think there's still a huge, considering that AFTI was never framed up around reducing emissions, you've got an unsustainable land use pattern driving all this, and you're still getting, with these interventions, you're still getting significant reductions in emissions, given that people are saying every 1% counts. So I think that messaging is really critical from my perspective as an environmental sustainability advisor, because otherwise it just becomes almost self-defeating before you even start. And I'd say another comment on that is the sort of, I can understand why TCC wanted to reduce the VKT, and I'm sure other councils wanted to as well, but the argument from MOT that Tauranga was substantially smaller than Hamilton, I mean, you know, was slightly under 160,000, Hamilton's slightly over 180,000. It's the geographical kind of layouts and things, but I mean, we're basically in the same ballpark, and there are cities all around the world who are facing the same sort of problems. So I think, you know, yes, growth is a huge issue. Yes, there are constraints, you know, working from home only does so much, but working, as I've done with some of the businesses around town, I think there are huge opportunities, but it comes back to the land use patterns, which is what Darren was pointing out earlier. And unless the land use pattern, unless AFTI changes, I still don't see how you can hope to turn these dials any faster, while still not wanting to say that these are, you know, there's still potential for good outcomes, but I'm just saying that's the constraint overall, isn't it?
If I can, there's probably 2 points to provide comments on. I don't think this tool is sending a particular message from TCC. It is there to aid conversation and for people to use and test different scenarios. That's certainly the way that it was put to our own council, and is the way it's presented here. It's a tool to aid and inform discussion and program development. It's evidence-based and based on a jointly agreed transport model output. The second point around the land use pattern and whether that's sustainable or otherwise, UFT very clearly considered and identified and assessed a number of different urban form options, and the analysis showed that each delivered a very similar output in terms of VKT. One wasn't particularly different to the other. So I think we probably just need to be aware of that as we have those conversations. You know, that work has been done as part of UFT's development and has, I guess, been considered by decision makers when they reach that position to agree the connected centres concept.
Mr. Chair, which is that there were 2 aspects, as you know. One is that certain things were ruled off the table, so I won't go down that rabbit hole. But the other thing was that when the connected centres was framed up, it was connected. And we had a conversation earlier about the Connecting Mount Maunganui project not enabling connections between Papamoa and the rest of Tauranga by public transport. So I guess I'm suggesting that there has not been an explicit look at what is the most low carbon land use model, and even with notwithstanding that, there has not been an explicit addressing of how to connect those centres in the most low carbon way. And so it'll always be sort of chasing a tail until that issue is confronted, especially when you look at the fact that TCC is constantly using per capita emissions, whereas the rest of New Zealand, including the ACT Party even, but all the other political parties have agreed that it is not a useful measure. You know, we have to look at total emissions. Sure, you can break it up in any way you want, but in terms of outlining this for the public and sending a message, it needs to be total emissions reductions in a growth environment that we look at.
If I may, I guess UFT considered multiple outcomes. Transport impact was one, urban form the other, and underneath that had a number of different objectives and benefits. And I guess decision makers settled on that sort of, I guess, balance of outcomes rather than a single outcome around carbon.
So, yeah, can you point the clarity? Then I'll go to the 2 years, but you go first.
Thank you, and really just picking up on Glenn's questioning. I said before wrongly that we needed to add another 3,000 homes a year, and Tauranga was actually more like 1,200, but notwithstanding that, that 1,200 is influencing the urban form of, what is it, 60,000 homes across the city. So you've got small opportunity to really make a substantial change in urban form through that mechanism, because it is, we've got what we've got. And that's what's driving the transport behaviour and patterns that we have. We've got multiple origins and destinations across the city, particularly the origins. People are coming from all parts of the city. And that's the inherent landform problem that we have, and we can't, regrettably, change that quickly. So that's why I made the point that it's really slow, because you're only really changing in 1,000 homes a year. But the second point is what's driving a lot of our urban form now is the affordability crisis in the city. And because we can't bring on land supply quickly enough, because we haven't invested in the infrastructure that enables us to, then people are going further and further out to get a cheaper home. And they're travelling further and further, and the VKTs are going up. And you've only got to look at the increased traffic that is now coming into Tauranga from Whakatane, Rotorua, Matamata, Mokoroa. And, people are progressively buying further and further out because that's what they can afford to do. So I agree with you, Glenn, in terms of what your aspiration is, and I fully support it. But I think what this model is telling us is that our urban form is what it is, and we've only got so many levers that we can pull. And what it's trying to do is then test, given those levers that we've got, where's the best bang for the buck? Now, we know actually we're going to have to pull everything up. And there's no question about that. But it's also designed to actually challenge us, to the reality of the challenge in front of us, and provide some evidence and science about what we can logistically change. There's no hesitation on the part of the governance of Tauranga City to do absolutely everything we can. And I go back to my earlier points around, targeted intensification, providing high frequency public transport services. But that's going to require investment in our infrastructure, which is the point you well make, as well as behaviour change. And what this tool really does underline is the size and significance of that challenge.
Okay, His Worship Mayor Luca, followed by His Worship Mayor Denia, then Councillor Von Daddleston on Zoom. Mayor Luca.
I'd like to start by thanking Glenn for showing that somebody got it. Small percentage increases in year-on-year growth rates will blow out of the water any small gains we make from emission reduction. The maths is clear. It's simple schoolboy math or schoolgirl maths. And I'm all for electrification. We've got to take what we can get, wherever we can get it. I just wonder about the electrical infrastructure that we have. In Whakatane, we have one charging station in town, that's it. More charging stations, more demand on the electrical grid and the generation capacity of the country. There are lots of flow-on effects. It's all very well to wish that we have electric cars everywhere, but there are other questions that have to, serious infrastructure questions that need to be asked as well. I'm wondering what the charging infrastructure is like in Tauranga City itself. Presumably it's more well developed than what we've got in Whakatane, but I don't know.
User of an electric vehicle when I was driving it in town, I can tell you they're few and far between.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on actually an earlier point that Commissioner Selwyn made, but he also reiterated just now, and that's why is VKT the top of the hierarchy? If we're looking about emissions specifically, then VKT can certainly play a part, but VKT seems to be at least as much about reducing congestion and that aspect of things. It seems to me that the electrification and going to EVs would be the far more key measure or criteria for doing the emissions reduction. So yeah, I just don't think the VKT, as you've said previously, is something that we can achieve many gains on.
Thank you, His Worship, Mayor Luca.
Yeah, sorry about this, but this brings up, of course, the equity problem that you alluded to before. Electric cars still aren't cheap. As the mayor, I can't buy New Zealand's car of the year because the budget doesn't allow it. If I'm in the outlying areas of our district, I'm struggling to buy a $10,000 car. So how are we going to deal with that? And that comes to your question, so I endorse what you said.
About to put the recommendation, which I'm happy to move, seconded by.
Can I have a?
Sorry, Councillor. I did see you waving at me there. My apologies, Councillor Von Nettleson.
Look, there's one quick win on this that Tauranga City can have, for instance, to get the emissions project tool back working, and that is to put pressure on central government to actually support accessible properties who bought a lot of the stock, about 1,200, just under 1,200, 1,180, I think, houses from the Housing Corporation, because they in the around 2017, just before the change in the election, the basis of that purchase was that central government would then help with their funding model so that they could actually develop those into 5,000 or 6,000 houses in the short term, affordable housing in the Te Papa Peninsula. We don't need to go into huge out into the bio to find room for housing. We can do it within Tauranga City. We can do it on a main corridor where we have public transport effective, but it needs some political support. It's pork barrel politics because the Labor government don't agree that National should have sold those houses. Forget about that. It's been done. Let's make sure we get them behind accessible properties and allow that, which is an arm of the IHC, allow that development to happen so that we can get another 4,000 to 6,000 houses in the Te Papa Peninsula in the near term. And it's going to take some pushing, and commissioners, I implore you, Stephen, to actually start pushing hard on this, because it will be a win-win for our city. It was exactly the right move actually to get it done, and they did the first project opposite the hospital, and it looked really great, and then it's stalled for lack of funding. And it's a funding model that they require, and it needs central government help in the funding. They're not asking for subsidies, they're just asking that they get the government rate for borrowing. And it's an easy win for this city if we actually are determined enough. So it needs some pushback by and some help by all those around the table. Thank you.
Okay, the report is there's a recommendation on page 204. I'll move. More, you happy to second? Seconded. I'll put it. All those in favour say aye. Against, carried. Moving on, we're on the home straight. James, welcome back.
Nice to be back.
Very much. James, I don't think you need any introduction, but obviously you'll explain the reasons that you're here to talk about making rail work.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. My colleague, Michael von Druggenbroek, is on Zoom, and he and I will be undertaking this presentation, and we will go through it as quickly as we possibly can.
Thank you.
So who are we? Because it's a question we're asked every time we have one of these presentations. So Making Rail Work is a collective of business professionals and residents of both the Bay of Plenty and Waikato. And our belief is that public transport connectivity is fundamentally important to our community and to our economy. And as a country, we need to change our approach and attitude to passenger rail. And services between Tauranga, Hamilton and Auckland provide an opportunity to do that. Katrina Ramage, unfortunately, is our project director. She can't be here today because she has some personal issues to deal with. But Michael and myself will take you through this presentation. We have an extended Making Rail Work team behind us with a number of professionals and consultants. But the important point to emphasise at the moment is that we are a collective, we're voluntary, other than some funding from Bay Trust and Trust Waikato. We're not a commercial organisation, so we are doing this essentially in our own time. So just a few common misconceptions. Michael will talk about the rail ones in a second, but I just want to make the point that we're not saying that passenger rail is something that can be delivered next week or even in the next few years. This is a long-term process, and that was without all of the challenges that have now come on board with the recent weather events affecting the rail network. But our view is we need to start the conversation and we need to start to do long-term planning around rail. Michael, if I can bring you in, could you just briefly go through some of those misconceptions that relate specifically to the rail network?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. One of the ones I'd like to touch on first is the interregional passenger rail will compromise the ability to move freight on the Tauranga corridor. It's very true that the Hamilton to Tauranga corridor all the way up to Auckland's busy with Metroport. You have Genesis Coal and various logging freight as well as Fonterra on parts of the corridor. However, on the maximum day, the number of trains that traverse the corridor is up to 36 through the Kaimai Tunnel. And that's a maximum. Most days are significantly more than that, and it's very rare that you would ever have that many trains moving through a day. So that would be basically 18 in each direction. So there's still quite a lot of capacity on the corridor to have passenger add. I might add that at the recent annual review to the Infrastructure and Transport Committee, KiwiRail stated quite clearly and quite strongly that capacity on the corridor is not an issue, and there is still significant capacity to grow. The bigger issue is really the tapacity to the end of the corridor at the ports in Auckland and in Tauranga. So there's no doubt that more trains can move. I think some people often refer to the Kaimai Tunnel being a constraint. Well, the way to look at the Kaimai Tunnel is just a single piece of track currently. The transit time is between 10 and 15 minutes to get through that tunnel. So again, it's not a major constraint. Some improvements might have to be made to make passenger reliable in terms of extraction in the same way they do in other tunnels in New Zealand. For example, the Rimataka Tunnel is just as long as is the Aotearoa Tunnel in the South Island. So again, it's a bit of a myth that the Kaimai Tunnel was a major constraint. There's plenty of capacity there with some modest interventions, and that includes signalling and double tracking. And the other thing is, as James talked about, is it is a long-term program. So we're not saying trains next week or even next year. So looking at that, I think it's really, really important. And also the issue that people often bring up is rail doesn't go where people need to go, and it's too slow and everything. That's not true at all. There's a lot of people can use rail from central nodes to central node, and last mile, as they call it internationally, or last kilometre movement is quite easily addressed, and quite often you can have park and ride facilities, and that's shown in various parts of New Zealand already. That distance from the nearest railway station isn't necessarily a major constraint. Next slide, please. So some of the critical success factors for passenger rail include supporting economic growth. I won't go through all of these in details. Supporting economic growth is really important. It's an enabler of growth in a way that other transport modes aren't necessarily able to do. It's demonstrated around the world, and that rail is actually a major multiplier for growth. It encourages agglomeration and encourages intensification of industry and central nodes of livability, etc. So that's really important, given some of the things that we've just been talking about in regards to Tauranga's challenges. Also, improving corridor and resilience, transportation by rail and having an alternative mode in Tauranga. You're particularly blessed because you've got the Kaimai Tunnel. is quite resilient, and it's probably somewhat more resilient than going over the Kaimai Range or through the Karangahape Gorge. So it does add an element of resilience. And also you can use the corridor and rail because it's built to such a high standard for things like telecommunications and fibre, major utilities. The rail corridor is ideally situated and able to do those things, and that's been proven in New Zealand already in the last 20 or 30 years. Obviously, climate change is a big part of it, reducing greenhouse gas emissions through vehicle kilometres travelled. And basically, rail is up to 3 times more efficient for freight, and for passenger, it can even be more so in terms of vehicle kilometres travelled. Encouraging land value capture through transit hubs, transit-orientated development. This is a part of the economic case for rail. It's really important. It enables people to commit to growth on certain nodes, encourages new towns. There's been quite positive acceptance of that around the world, and I've recently done a paper on that, which I've just recently published on my LinkedIn page, but it was also presented to the Parliamentary Select Committee. Attracting overseas investment to New Zealand is also important. Rail attracts investment because it gives greater certainty to people about intensification. You see this at places like Ruakura Hub, for example, or Tainui are investing in rail connectivity with their new intermodal inland port at Ruakura, just east of Hamilton there. So there's a whole lot of other things on there which I won't go on into at this stage, but I'll hand back to James to talk about the RTP and passenger rail.
Thank you, Michael. So this is just a very, very brief reminder that the Bay of Plenty and the Waikato RPTPs both are committed to further investigations into development of interregional passenger rail services. So hopefully we're pushing an open door, and we're looking forward to working with those councils to progress those particular actions. The map on the right-hand side comes from the Waikato RPTP, and it just goes to show that rail is actually only one part of the integrated public transport system picture. You'll hopefully see the yellow line very faintly snaking from Hamilton up to Auckland, and then the grey line across from Hamilton to Tauranga. So ideally, of course, what we'd like to see is that yellow line, which is the current Tahuia service, extended to Tauranga and significantly improved. So there's that through connection to Hamilton and to Auckland, so to make the Golden Triangle really connected. It isn't just about trains as well. That's the other point to make here. So these are Katrina's slides, and I'll try and do them justice. But making rail work is as much as anything about what's called a development cooperative. And this combines a traditional development corporation model, like the one that was used to deliver the London 2012 Olympics, but it gives it a Kiwi twist. And the Kiwi twist is a cooperative structure. So the thing to remember about a cooperative is that all the members have equal rights and equal say in what happens. So it can't be taken over by one organisation or one sectional interest. So we believe a cooperative approach therefore enables a much more community-based, collaborative planning approach. And this slide just simply sketches out what it could look like with a cooperative board in the middle, the government political on the red, and the officers and civil servants on the green. So Fonterra and Mitre 10, they are two very famous Kiwi cooperatives. So Fonterra, you think cows, Mitre 10, you think hammer drills, making rail work, you think development around stations, because the stations are the hubs, the nodes where development can be clustered in the future and provide much greater access. So if we can use a development cooperative to get all those landowners together, to work together to develop their land in the way that actually suits the community and society, that's really what we're looking to do. I won't go through this structure in any great detail, but essentially it would be constructed around a development oversight board with advisory committees and a whole series of work streams at the bottom there. The important point to make here is that what we're not looking to do is actually just set up another structure. So we're not looking to employ even more consultants or contractors. We're actually looking to use this and use existing resources, secondments from existing organisations, not just to create a whole new bureaucratic structure. So again, that's a clear difference from other forms of organisation and governance. So Michael will very, very quickly just tell you about what we've done so far and what we're planning to do before I'll finish with summing up.
Yes, engagement activity to date. So we've been quite busy over the last 12 months in particular. In May of last year, the Making Rail Work was republished after a 6 months evidence review. And we've been engaging with various government agencies since that period, including Ministry of Transport, Kiwi Rail, Waikato High, various regional councils in the area, particularly Waikato and Tauranga City Council. Also, we've been talking quite a lot to the central government agencies, in particular the Parliamentary Select Committee hearings on interregional passenger rail that happened in September to November of last year. That's a inquiry into the future of interregional passenger rail, and we've been quite strong in our submissions in that regard and had particularly good feedback from all political parties, including Acton, National and Labour, as well as the Greens, as you would expect. We've been recruiting also a support team, and we've been having positive engagement with the likes of Te Waka and Futureproof, and we've also presented to various other agencies, including Priority One, been talking with Ports of Tauranga and Bay of Plenty Regional Councils, and the work that we're doing today, for example, is evidence of that process. Next slide, please. So where to from here? So we're looking to publish an open letter to all political parties to include passenger rail as a part of their manifesto. We've had particularly good engagement from some parties, including the ACT Party. Simon Court, for example, already has spoken quite positively to us with our ideas, as has National through David Bennett, and we've got very good engagement with Michael Wood's office and Michael Wood himself also. So we're looking also to contribute to the government policy, the GPS Statement on Land Transport, that's just been released for consultation in draft form. We're publishing a second report, Beyond the Tracks. There's a very important rail conference in Wellington on the 28th of June that we're a key part of, including, and that will be various political leaders from all the parties that are interested in this in various ways, as well as key agency leaders from Kiwi Rail, Transdev, Auckland One Rail, etc., and the Transport Agency, NZTA, as well as Ministry of Transport. So we've got excellent engagement leading up to the general election later this year, and finalising our submission and looking forward to the revised government policy statement on transport. And taking on beyond that is the Land Transport Plan in April and the National Land Transport Programme in June of 2024. So we're very busy, and we continue to sort of make rapid progress in this space. Back to James.
Thank you. So this is the final slide. So what are we asking of you as the Regional Transport Committee today? So firstly, honest and constructive feedback and ideas for further investigation. I want to make it very clear, we don't have all the answers. We are looking to work with people across the region who can help us with those answers. So hopefully we will establish a close working relationship with Regional Transport Committee and its members starting today. We would like to ask for, in principle, support for progressing a development cooperative, working with those colleagues, particularly those involved in the regional spatial strategy. In principle, doesn't mean you need to agree with everything we say, or it doesn't mean to say you don't have any concerns or you're not somewhat sceptical, but we're looking for, I guess, some constructive engagement and challenge. Interesting, the discussions around UFTI a little bit earlier in the meeting. So we do feel that a review of UFTI and a re-examination of the rail-enabled growth option would be a good idea. That isn't to say that we believe necessarily everything in UFTI is wrong and that connected centres needs to be thrown out. But we do feel that UFTI did provide some good evidence of what rail could do in certain circumstances, so it'd be useful to re-examine that work. Very keen to work with the Bay of Plenty Regional Council, Public Transport Committee in particular, to progress that RPT policy and work in partnership with Waikato Regional Council. I will just refer to my previous role just once. I don't particularly want this to be yet another burden on my former colleagues in the Regional Transport Plan team at the Bay of Plenty. So one of the things we need to think about is, how the resources going to be allocated to this, because those folks are already extremely busy. So it's not just another ask without more resources. Finally, and this is perhaps the big one, at some point we're going to have to do a business case, because we've got a lot of ideas, we've got what we think is a great concept, but it has to be tested with evidence, and we have to establish pretty critical things like, who's going to use the service, and how much are they going to pay for it, and how much is it all going to cost. All those answers ultimately require a business case, so we would certainly be interested in discussing some kind of funding contribution to a business case through the next RLTP, with the regional councils and local councils acting as approved organisations for that money. That's really all we want to say today. Happy to take any questions, and hopefully look forward to working with you all in the future. Thank you.
Good to have you here, James, and another slick presentation. You were true to form. Before I hand over to Michael for comment, as you can appreciate, we can't make any fundamental decisions here today, but in good faith and as a gesture, I will certainly ask that those 6 key bullet points there be forwarded to staff, and that they report back to us in due course.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
You have my assurance on that. So, Michael, would you like to make some general comments?
Yeah, I think in terms of rail and the Bay of Plenty, this is a strategic question, and really we need the committee just to think upon the next 10 years, and where does this particular mode sort of fit in that thinking, in or out. So I'd be interested in hearing from the committee members around the sort of the strategic nature of what we're being asked, because preparation for this type of work can go into the years. And I agree with James in terms of the work that's required here is kind of considerable. So there's a lot of stage gate processes that you'd go through, and it's the kind of thing where we either divert, or divert is the wrong word, use staff time in order to consider these questions on a strategic nature for the 10-year view, or not.
Angus, you're there somewhere with your hand up. Here he comes.
Kia ora koutou. Sorry, first of all, for not being there today. We've got quite a bit to do in terms of the Hawke's Bay rebuild, so I thought it was sensible to stay in Wellington, but it has meant I've been sitting here listening and probably not participating as much as I normally would, so apologies for that. I just wanted to make a couple of comments in terms of the network side, and just support a few of the things that James and Michael have just passed on to you around the capacity of the network, how it interrelates with the freight piece, and those sort of misconceptions around the Kaimai tunnel. So I just want to be clear that we agree with the views that they've just said there. There absolutely is capacity on the network. It's not there isn't trains butting up against each other every single 10 minutes or so, as you see in highly dense parts of the network, like in Auckland. There is room for other trains to be running on the network there. There absolutely would need to be some network additions made to enable additional services to come through. And Michael's right. Those are things like some longer crossing loops either side of the tunnel, so that you can stage things sensibly and run them through. There would also have to be some serious work done inside the Kaimai tunnel, because in the end we have a regulator being Waka Kotahi, different hats from the folks who are sitting there with you today, and they would expect some improvements to be made to the tunnel in order for passengers to be passing through it. So all of those are questions that need an answer, and as James said, those are questions that would need to be answered through a business case. I think my suggestion to the folks here is there is work ahead of us to do that. Waikato Regional Council has put into the RRPTP an intention to do a feasibility study about this over the next 3 years. I would encourage Bay of Plenty to join alongside them and do that bit of work. We'll be able to support them with the network requirements, and I think Michael and his team, I mean, they have a role to play as community advocates by feeding into that piece. That's probably enough.
Cool. Thanks, Angus. Any final comments? Oh, beg your pardon. Here we go. We're going to get train services to Whakatane and to the west. Mayor Denia.
Thank you. I think it's a very intriguing proposal, and I thank you for bringing it forward. Passenger rail services in this part of the world has been kicked around for some time, and one hears different views about whether it's fundamentally feasible or not, whether the population's enough. Personally, I'm quite excited by at least the prospect of it, and would like to understand whether it is indeed feasible. And so there's a number of asks there, and ultimately a business case or feasibility study sounds like it would be useful for us.
Before I pass over to Mayor Luca, just as a point of clarification, is this mainly a focus that's going to occur around the Western Bay, or, because I hear former Mayor Chadwick sitting on my shoulder screaming in my ear.
So did I.
I thought you came from Rotorua. So
yeah. Look, at the moment,
save me here, James.
yeah, I will save you. Right, okay, Councillor Thurston, since you've been so kind to me, I will absolutely emphasise that it shouldn't just necessarily be about Tauranga. My view is that Rotorua is connected to the rail network, can be connected to the Golden Triangle. So, as part of any feasibility study and business case, we will be very interested in including Rotorua in that, because the more centres you have outside of Auckland feeding into Auckland, the more demand you're likely to create. Of course, you will have costs associated with another line. But look, at the moment, we're very flexible. It's not Tauranga and nothing else.
I just wanted to get that into the minutes, as you can well imagine.
It's very, very clear.
It's worship, Mayor Luca.
I would strongly endorse what you guys are doing. I think rail was fundamental in early development of all nations. There's real value in that infrastructure, and I guess it's going to have its day again for maybe different reasons. I've got a basic question for you though. How much, you said in your talk that it wasn't all about tracks and rolling stock, but how much new rail track have we developed in this country in the last 30 years, and who paid for it?
Right, Michael will answer that one because he's our rail expert.
Yes, well, that's an excellent question. There hasn't been a lot of new rail track developed. What's really been happening in the last 30, 40 years, is particularly in the last 10 years, is improvement to existing railways, adding capacity, for example, double tracking in Auckland. And there was probably about a good 20 kilometres of double tracking added to the network, where you previously had single track. There was one additional spur, the Manukau branch line, that was only about 3 kilometres double track in Auckland, that was added in 2010. Basically, what you've really seen is a rehabilitation of the network, bringing it up to more modern standards. There has been some retreat, in fact, away from connectivity to parts of the network, and I point out about the previous question about Rotorua. It had passenger trains until October 2001, and they were cancelled at that time, and it hasn't really seen any passenger trains since that period. But overall, the network is in quite good shape. It's tending to be reinvested in. There's been a lot of commitment in the last 5 to 10 years in particular, particularly in Auckland and Wellington, but there's also been quite a lot of rehabilitation, and the railway generally is taking higher axle loads at generally more consistent speeds, not necessarily faster, obviously, at top speed, but more consistent speeds, which is really important. So the network's becoming more resilient as we replace what was essentially 19th century infrastructure in many places.
So how was that 19th century infrastructure paid for? How was it funded?
So yeah, that's an excellent question. Initially, there was some private investment in the railways in New Zealand in the 1860s and 1870s, but Julius Vogel, about 1873, went and got a loan from the United Kingdom to fund the railways. So it was actually funded offshore predominantly, and then that was paid back via annuities, etc., and opened up the country, and the payback was more through economic growth and wealth that the railway connections instigated. In particular, Michael Joseph Savage in 1938 said something to the fact that for years and years the landlord stood still and was making lots of money off the land that was developed, but meanwhile the railways were painted on the clouds as losing money all the time. And when one looks at it more holistically, you would say, well, the railways as a system didn't capture the value it created. That value the railway created was captured by everywhere else in New Zealand. New Zealand would not be what it is today without the rail network. And that's a proven fact right from the 1860s onwards. So yes, it was funded by overseas investment, taxpayers, some private investment in the early days, and more over time. We're suggesting that value contributions and value capture can help fund the railway going forward into the future.
Can I just add to that in terms of how it's currently funded? So maintenance and renewal for the entire national rail network is paid for from the Rail Network Investment Program, and that is paid to us, KiwiRail, by Waka Kotahi, so it's part of the NLTF. However, it isn't entirely 100% paid for by what we'd normally regard as NLTF being pit and ruck, fuel excise duties and road user charges. The government tops up the NLTF to pay for the vast bulk of what's in the Rail Network Investment Program, so it's actually general taxation that's paying for it. We also, KiwiRail, pay into the NLTF. We pay a track user charge as a contribution towards our costs as a freight operator of using the rail network. Then in addition to that, because we're an owner and we have access arrangements with other rail users, the main ones being Greater Wellington Regional Council for their metropolitan services and Auckland Transport for their metropolitan services. So they pay us a contribution towards the maintenance of their networks in those two centres. So there is a fair bit of mix, but generally speaking, the vast bulk of those costs are paid for by taxpayers, but there are some user pays in there as well. And I suppose the next question that someone might be interested in asking is, well, is that reasonable? Our view is, yes, it is reasonable, because maintenance of an asset is always needed in order to make use of those assets, and using those assets generates up to $2.1 billion of economic value every year.
Yeah, Commissioner Selwyn.
Just a quick observation, we shouldn't forget 4, 5 or 6 billion, whatever the number is, that's going into the Auckland Central Rail Link at the moment, which is being funded both by City Council and by central government, and plans of the current government at least to spend somewhere between 14 and 30 billion on a light rail connection in Auckland. So just how all this gets funded, just only knows.
Yeah, I might add to that I wrote a paper recently that basically suggested ways of funding, and internationally, and I've worked quite a lot overseas, particularly in Australia and in the Middle East. They have what they call suburban rail loop in Australia, and the whole idea of that is that it's funded through value capture and all the agglomeration benefits. And my paper recently explored that in New Zealand as a way of helping to fund the railway, because I think we can all agree that over the longer term, the taxpayer can't fund all this directly. I think the whole idea of our report is to suggest alternative ways of funding rather than just relying on taxpayers or ratepayers bearing the burden of that. And as I pointed out in that rough quote from Michael Joseph Savage from 1938, which is quoted in my submission, it's really true that a lot of the value created by railways and railway systems are captured by the private sector, and they're basically taking it as a free good.
I always remember when Lyndon Johnson came to New Zealand and he said to Holyoake that you won't know where I'm from, but I'm from the state of Texas, and it is so big it takes 3 days to cross it in a train. And Holyoake said yes, and we got slow trains here too. So there you go. Okay. Councillor Shearer.
Just some history repeating itself, but I think it's worth making a contribution. The original investment of the roading network, of course, was meant to be on a formula of betterment, and the betterment is huge. The early settlers getting their wool and then with refrigerated shipping the meat to market was huge, but the landed gentry who captured the parliament in the 1880s, 1890s totally reneged on that and changed it, and the taxpayer bore the brunt, and the Vogel loans weren't paid back until the 1950s. It essentially almost bankrupted the country.
Okay,
yes,
James,
that's a key lesson to learn, and that's one of the key lessons we're saying, that you need to have a mechanism in place to make sure that doesn't happen again for transport investment more generally, not just for rail, for all transport really.
Okay. So, Michael and James, thanks again for your presentation.
Thank you, guys.
And as I said, you have our assurance that we've referred it to staff, and they will get back to us in due course, commenting on your 6 bullet points.
Thank you very much, and great to see you all again. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Okay, since there's an action in there, we'll result to receive it. I will move, seconded Commissioner Selwood. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. I know you're all screaming out for lunch, so what we normally do at this point is do a big whip around and anyone makes some final comments or some take-home messages or what's hot in their spot around the region. In lieu of that, I'll ask anyone who wishes to say something, speak now if ever hold your peace. So everyone happy? Greg, did you want to say a couple of words and give us your rank, name and serial number and category?
So pleased to be here today. Just a little bit, I've been sitting here and listening a little bit about electric vehicles and electric trucks that may come in and eventually move freight. You know, there's a lot of things to work through. We don't actually have rules and regulations and legislation in place to do this. These vehicles are going to be heavier. They will put more stress onto the already infrastructure that we have that can't cope with what it's got now. So to do that, we're going to be held by the rest of the world. When we want to bring a truck in, for example, we won't be able to build what we want here and have. We'll get told what we're going to have, and we're going to have to make that work on an infrastructure that won't support it. So there's no rules, the equipment. You go to Waka Kotahi, you'll probably get an exemption to put an electric vehicle on the road to trial, but it's overweight. It can't be sustained on our infrastructure. That's just one of the smaller things that will, because we have a freight task that's going to increase somewhere along the line, if we don't have an infrastructure that can take what we want to do, we're going to struggle to actually achieve the outcomes that we think. And it's funding. It comes down to where are those funds? We can get those funds in Auckland for that rail, but when we've got critical networks that need funding, we're not getting it. I think we're pursuing some things in the wrong areas, really. Thanks for having me here today.
It's good to have you on board, Greg. You know, Ken Shirley picked well, so that's good to have you here. Thank you everyone for your contribution today and your attendance, particularly those on Zoom. Commissioner Selwood, Investment Logic Map, we're going to work on that workshop date and time, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible and work out who will be involved in those workshops. So our diaries are pretty full here, but I know Amanda and Michael collectively will work out a date that suits everybody. So thank you everyone for your attendance. And as I said, there's Food for Africa down the back. So